Okay, I'll go to the speaker view. Okay. Welcome, everyone. So we're really happy to have you all here. Excited that EAP is happening again. The 7th iteration. It seems like kind of weird to say 7 already, that it's been 7 years since we started doing this, but yeah, really exciting. I think it's a good idea to introduce ourselves real quick. There, now you can see Thomas. Yes, I'm Neil Thompson. I'm an associate professor here at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. EAP is something that a group of us kicked off in 2016, and I'm very happy to have it continue. And practice theories have been a big part of my research. Maybe not the only part of my research, but a big part of my research, and it will going forward. So I think, yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and I hope you enjoy the conference. Let's maybe go to Sarah next.
Hi, good morning, everyone. For me, it's good night, as you probably heard already. It's 12:30 here, so bear with me as my brain is still waking up, but also still sleeping. So yeah, so I'm Sarah. I'm at the University of Victoria in Canada. And I do a bit of practice research, like Neil. Not all of it is practice research, but I do practice research more from you know, it reflects really my passion and my background in the arts and in entrepreneurship. So I'll do work in arts entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship and aesthetics, and qualitative methodologies as well. And I'm really looking forward to the conference this year. I've been attending EAP for a few years now, and it's a lovely group. I absolutely appreciate, you know, the support and everything that I've learned so far over the years with this group. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Orla, you want to go next?
I can't believe I still speak with mute on. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm Orla Byrne. I'm at University College Dublin. And yeah, as Neil was saying, it's great to be here at number 7. So I've been at them all so far. And to be honest, the PhD day is always great to recap and learn. So even though I've attended it for most years, I've always learned something new each year. So I started getting interested in this, yeah, about 7-8 years ago in practice research, and I'm still learning about it all the time. So like Sarah and Neil, I use practice approaches in some of my research. And yeah, I'm really excited for today's event and the discussions that will happen from it. And I hope you enjoy it as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas.
Yes, welcome everybody. My name is Thomas. I am from Jönköping University, Jönköping International Business School in Sweden. And my first EAP was in fact as a PhD student. So I'm newly graduated, you could almost say. Well, that's more than a year now ago. I'm now an assistant professor at the Jönköping University. And even though I do a lot of research, it's not all practice-based. My dissertation was from a philosophical standpoint, practice-based, and I've been participating in these events with great joy, and it's always nice to learn something new about practice research and entrepreneurship and organization. So I'm happy to participate.
Great, thank you, Thomas. All right. So a little bit about the participants. We have, I think, last time I checked, 68 unique conference participants, but of course we have like this option of splitting up through different days. So this is what I had to count in the registration for today. We had 4 people attending in person. Welcome. And we have 40 people attending online. That's basically our group. So where is everybody from? Well, I was actually really happy and kind of surprised with the distribution. You can see there's quite international group that we have signed up today from all different countries. We have single participants from Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Germany, Israel, Lithuania, Pakistan, South Africa, Suriname, Switzerland, Taiwan. And then we have multiple people, which I'm really surprised about, from places like Australia, because I can't imagine what time it is for there. Actually, it's in advance, so maybe it's okay. It's worse for Sarah, I guess.
Yeah.
And we have multiple people from India, and actually quite a number of people from the United States, which I was surprised to see, given also the time difference. So welcome. And the UK is actually very highly represented. So welcome, everybody. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to do a round table of introductions with everybody, but I hope at least you'll get some, when we have the discussion, some insight into the rest of the group. All right, so what are we doing today? What's the motivation for today? Well, we always have this first day that's kind of an introduction to EAP, because yeah, it's a difficult theoretical framework to work with, or difficult. It's just new, so it's sometimes challenging to wrap your mind around. We have an answer your questions section, although we're hardly going to be able to answer all your questions. We'll still have a nice discussion. So we'll have a nice discussion as a group of the organizers based on all of the questions that people submitted. We had a whole bunch of questions submitted and some really fabulous ones, so we had to make some selections about which ones to actually talk about, and then we'll focus on those for the time being. Yeah, and another main aim of this day is to encourage you to really explore EAP practice theories in particular. It is a very publishable way of framing your research. It's also very insightful to study and explain things via social practices. So yeah, we encourage you to use EAP in your research. I see more and more act as a reviewer, of course, for a lot of journals, and I see a lot of EAP research coming out, which is fantastic. But as Bill will probably say in some time, publishing is about a community of scholars, and we need a community of scholars to write things, to review things, and the bigger we can get this EAP research, the better it is for each individual person, let's say. So as you can tell, it's a very international group of scholars. It's really fun to talk with people all over the world, make connections. Me personally, it's been my main route of making a network and collaborations for research that has paid off, doublefold. Not only been fun, but professionally, it's been a huge value. So I really encourage everybody to give it a shot, join the community. We have a lot of other events I'll talk about at the end of the session that you might be able to jump onto. It's pretty, low investment in that sense of money, but in terms of payoff in time and network, it's really nice. So I really encourage you to continue talking with the international community. This is our agenda for today. Bill Gartner will be online with us. He'll give, I don't know exactly what he's going to say. It's Bill. We'll say something creative, I'm sure. The title is Why Practice Theory for Entrepreneurship Research and Why Now? And we'll have about an hour with Bill. That includes some question and answer. So I think, and discussion. We'll have plenty of time to talk there. We'll take a half an hour break. And then we'll come back as a panel. The organizers will talk about some of those selected questions that you proposed, that we asked you to bring forth. Yeah, then we'll have a nice, easy cruise into lunch at 1 o'clock. Then we're back at 2, and we'll talk for an hour and a half again as the organizers about our own career pathways and progressions using EAP. Well, anything about academic careers that you want to talk about. The reason we're doing this, we haven't done this before, but the reason we're doing this is we were discussing as an organizing team that it's often unclear maybe about if you use EAP, can you make a career out of using EAP? And that's a barrier that I think some people ask themselves and want to know more about, especially because this is a early career research day. So we'll talk a lot about that, about, there's many paths to Rome. So there's different ways of progressing in your career and crafting your career and what you want to do. And we'll talk a lot about that. And then we'll wrap it up and have a quick introduction for other EAP events before we close the conference. Before I move on, I wanted to just say this day is brought to us and funded by our graduate school. It's called the Amsterdam Business Research Institute. It's a very great way to connect to the VU Amsterdam, and our grad school has many great programs. So if you're looking at following up for postdocs and things like that, check out our graduate school, it'd be really nice. Of course, I also want to welcome and say thank you to Bill Gartner for giving his time and showing up to give a talk for us. And then lastly, I don't know if Richard's here right now or not, but the Entrepreneurship Studies Network is also funded part of this conference to keep our costs, cover some of our costs, particularly some of the social events. So I want to say thank you very much for the Entrepreneurship Studies Network. If you have any interest in these things, you can see their websites and the QRs. Okay. Do you other organizers want to say anything before we get started? I don't know what time it is actually. Yeah, still 15 minutes before I think Bill was going to start.
Just so do the participants have any questions at this stage?
Yeah.
Is there any questions from the floor?
How many people do we have actually? 15.
Because we have quite a lot of questions for the panel discussion on practice theory, your questions answered, but I'm thinking perhaps maybe we could use this time as an opportunity to discuss some of those just loosely or broadly before Bill starts, if there's no questions from the floor.
That's a nice way to fill 15 minutes for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and then whenever Bill joins, then we can start his session.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so one thing that comes to mind is I'm quite curious with Thomas and Sarah, and I know Neil's story quite well at this stage because we've worked closely for a number of years. But what got ye interested in practice research?
Ladies first.
Good question. So, it's interesting. I think I was doing practice research without even realizing it. When I was doing my dissertation 8 years ago or something, and going into the field, I was really looking at practices and, I was trying to make sense of all of this. And then I see a call of so there was a session at the academy. It was a SAP meets EMT session, and so I read it, and I think it was like citations. It had citations of work that I was drawing from, like Johannesson, and active research, all of that. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. I don't know what this is. So I went and that's where I met, I think, Neil and Bill. Dimov was there too. And I thought it was such a fascinating group of people and very supportive of the type of work that I was doing as well, which, it's very ethnographic, it's very immersed, and sometimes it's kind of hard to find your group of people to help you navigate some of the difficulties that you also have in the field doing this type of research, right? So then from there, I just tried to attend every EAP that I could and build my network of like-minded scholars, and it's just been great. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Sarah. What about yourself, Thomas?
I think I took a very pragmatic route. So when I started my PhD in 2015, there were some calls or some voices that were asking for more action-oriented entrepreneurship research. And as a PhD student, I said, well, and that's what I'm going to do. So I started to collect data about what entrepreneurs are doing, and I wanted to understand the processes of it. And then, of course, the question pops up, well, how do you make sense of it? And what is it that they are doing? And I thought that practice theoretical underpinning could give me the answers there. So then I started reading about it. And then, together with my pragmatic side, I also have a philosophical side. So I like to read like these deep, difficult texts. So then perhaps it was similar for you guys, but I stumbled over Shatsky, and it's like, okay, I can spend some hours reading this paper. And, this is how I gradually sort of develop my relationship with this practice theory. So I think it is a useful lens. It is a useful view to understand, especially sort of not individual based what is going on, but the activities and actions and processes that are ongoing in entrepreneurship. Yes.
So So you relish in the dense, difficult texts of it all, Thomas.
I think no longer, because I find myself having less and less time to really spend on reading like deep philosophical works. I mean, and then you then don't want to spend your holidays doing that stuff either. You want to shut off at some point. But yeah, I think during my PhD, I really enjoyed it. So
Great. And what about yourself, Neil?
I started so my PhD was not using practice theories, although I was really interested in it during the time. My supervisors were not very encouraging in that regard. But I was reading a lot of like larger texts like Thomas, and I read a lot of Anthony Giddens' work. And that was just really resonated with me. I thought it was like, why isn't anybody doing this for entrepreneurship studies? Because it just seemed so relevant and so different from what most entrepreneurship researchers were doing. And I thought that, yeah, there should be more of this type of research. I thought there was a lot of opportunity there. And so then I also read Davide Niccolini's book, Practice Theory, Work and Organization, which is like my Bible, because he really unpacks everything that in a really clear way about what practice theory is. And although he doesn't talk about entrepreneurship, it really makes you can see a lot of connections if you imagine those kinds of connections. And I was really, super enthusiastic, but coming to the field from a different, theoretical, I was using institutional theory in my dissertation. I spent some time learning about what it means to do this kind of research. And I went to some winter schools. I got really into ethnomethodology. So Orla and I's recent paper is really using the video ethnography. And that was super fascinating and really fun to do, but a big challenge as having not done that kind of research in that way before. But very rewarding, very nice. So yeah, that's what interested me. And I mean, generally speaking, the weak argument for practice theory is that entrepreneurship is a process, and that everything that we should study when it comes to entrepreneurship is something about an unfolding process. That's fine, and that's a nice general statement, but practice theories goes much further than this in terms of bringing in what practices are, how to theorize them, and how to use them to explain phenomena, which I didn't see anybody doing, which I thought was really important.
What you all then?
I see Bill has just joined, but for me, so I didn't do my use practice research at all in my thesis either. So I was doing my postdoc in Bath, and I was working with Demo, and then I had some colleagues who had come, who had done a lot of strategy as practice research as well. And so we just started the conversation, well, what would that look like in entrepreneurship? What would entrepreneurship as practice look like? So my interest came mostly from the empirical work from strategy as practice and seeing how the concepts were applied in that context, and then thinking about what that would look like in entrepreneurship. And then just jumping completely into the deep end and collecting loads of data that could capture practices, and then trying to think, well, what's that theory behind this, and try to make sense of it that way. So I almost came at it from that backwards perspective, but looking at the field and trying to figure out what was happening in the field from a conceptual basis, I suppose. So I've definitely my time in Bath to thank for joining the dots up between entrepreneurship practice, and then taking good example from strategy as practice and seeing what they had done as well. So yes, so I think it's good. Hopefully we get around to everybody in the PhD group as the day goes on and find out what your interest and motivation was in practice research and what you're doing for your own theses as well. But perhaps for now, do you want to introduce Bill and welcome him? Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
But I'm early, right? Because I think 10 a.m. is in like 8 minutes.
8 minutes. You are early. We have plenty of time today. This is a day for discussion. Open-ended. We're being creative and flexible. So.
Good. Thank you. Good.
How are you, Bill?
Doing well.
Where are you right now?
Excited to be out. So I'm actually back in Boston. So, I was, I'm kind of for family reasons, I couldn't stay in Europe as long as I wanted. So I was there for about 5 days back, and maybe I'll be back again. So things got a bit complicated, but I'm really happy and looking forward to this and excited that the conference is being held.
Yeah, me
Yay.
too. I'm excited about, experimenting with this hybrid format too.
Yeah.
So far it seems to be working pretty well to me. I hope that's true for everybody else, but yeah, I think it's a really kind of maybe the future of conference in a way. So
yeah, certainly I think it helps draw more numbers because not everyone can fly to a particular location on a particular day. So yeah, I think it is the future.
And I think, well, from my perspective anyway, it's far more family friendly. So I was saying to my my husband and child next door, like, I'm not going to be here for lunches or for pickups or for any of that kind of thing. I'm getting all of this out front of, like, write me out for the week. But then I was saying, the upside is that I'm actually here. The alternative would be that I'm in Amsterdam for 4 days, and it's just not very conducive to family life. You've got smallies around, I suppose. So yeah, it's nice to be able to do a bit of both. And you miss out on the networking. Definitely face-to-face networking is lovely at conferences and building up those connections and everything, but it's certainly better than not having it at all, I think. Can I ask, for the people who are physically present, did you travel to Amsterdam, or are you all based in VU, or?
I can start. Hey, my name is Karthik, and I'm from Rotterdam School of Management. It's not that bad, just a half-an-hour train ride.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael. I'm from Aarhus in Denmark, but I'm here in Amsterdam for a month for research stage.
Okay, so it's good timing for you.
Yeah, it's really good timing. And my family arrived yesterday, so they're at the hotel.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, but I'm also, I have a home also in Germany because my wife's living there. So I combined it with a Germany visit, and then the travel is not too far to Amsterdam.
Great.
I'm here. I'm living on Texel, but I'm working at the VU. So
it was easy for you.
It was easy for me. Yes.
Great. Well, it makes sense. It's great to have some people present at least as well.
Okay, should we start with Bill? Orla, thanks. Bill, are you ready to go? Do you need
I'm ready to go.
Anything?
I'm excited.
Okay,
so,
great.
So, and I'm assuming it is Q&A. I don't have any slides, but I think we're just going to dialogue. So hopefully everyone has questions and has opinions, and we'll begin.
Well, maybe I can start it off then. Why practice theory and entrepreneurship studies? Why now? What's the gap that EAP is filling, or what's the motivation, I suppose, in your opinion?
Oh. Yeah, so I thought today I'd kind of give a brief history of kind of where the field's gone. So, to begin at the prehistory, the field's fairly young. It really started in the 70s at a conference in 1974 where they started an entrepreneurship interest group, and there was parallel issues in Europe as well. And certainly the big struggle was just legitimacy about the nature of what entrepreneurship was, because the field in business, certainly in the Academy of Management, was primarily larger organizations and studying them and how they behave. And that the feeling certainly was too that almost all of the growth and innovation would occur through larger companies and organizations. So to figure out how to manage that and do that better was really everyone's focus. So, it slowly emerged in the 1980s as it became a division. But my original research, and I think a number of other people like Barbara Bird's, was about, and a number of other people too in the field, was certainly looking at entrepreneurial behavior and what entrepreneurs do. But given that the majority of people were coming out of strategy and kind of firm level problems, the interest in individuals actually was rather small. And I think it's waxed and waned for a long time. In fact, still, I think the challenge of entrepreneurship as practice will be kind of to think about how one orients oneself to this issue of kind of individual organization or environmental levels. So I think and another couple things too are emerging at the same time. Certainly the field and kind of ways to establish its legitimacy, but I think the academy as a whole was enamored with quantitative ways of looking at variance among individuals and organizations' environments. And so if you didn't have numbers in some particular way and didn't have some kind of linear regression model, it was really difficult to get published. So there was very little interest in kind of ethnographic methodologies. Now, that has really changed over time. I mean, certainly there's been case studies in all the major journals, but it's really been in the last, I'd say, 15 years that there's been strong legitimacy for being in the field, doing qualitative work, and being able to pay attention to individuals and organizations the way entrepreneurship of practice does it. You know, I think too that other appreciation is this kind of relationality in relationship to behavior. So it's just not people doing particular things, but it's people doing particular things in a particular context with particular people and interacting with them over time. So, you know, I think the sense of what people do has become more sophisticated, but also certainly more relational, interactive. So, you know, that was set up certainly by, you know, Shotsky and Nicolini, but maybe we can say some of it was Giddens. And, you know, there's lots of people, I think, kind of working towards convergence, but it certainly wasn't there in the 80s or even the 90s. So, you know, I think things have taken off because, you know, we're all, for a number of reasons too. Another one is that, you know, the failure of quantitative methodologies, and I'll go back into my own career to say, so there were two major concerns that we were trying to address with the panel study of entrepreneurial dynamics. One was, what's the generalizability of the phenomenon? How is it different across different individuals? But also, if we could we look at individuals behaving over time? And so in one sense, we were able to create generalizable samples in a number of different countries and compare how and why entrepreneurs did what they did. But we also were able to do that longitudinally, where we had a five-year flow. But you know, the challenge was that was all for the most part quantitative, and it was very hard to really make sense of what people were actually doing and why when you had just a bunch of numbers for those 5 years. And so, you know, there were just huge inadequacies with what we could really talk about. And I think that really brought to the fore that if we're going to look at what people are doing and why they're doing what they're doing over time, we need to be in the field, and that's okay. You know, I think that, and sorry, I'm going to babble a bit and then we'll open it up too. I think this is one of the things that's also still a struggle in the journals and also with the zeitgeist of where the field is. I think one of the things that entrepreneurship practice provides a sensibility about is an opportunity just to report on what happened, without being what I would say is having some theory to explain it. You know, we can look at other fields, you know, if we're a scientific field, we could look at other fields like biology, where people can spend their careers just describing the phenomenon. They can look at an animal behaving in a certain way, and that's their publications. You know, I spent a year looking at chimpanzees, and this is what they did, but there's no why in it. And we've always struggled, I think, with that issue of, can you just report on what happens? And then at some point, through the aggregation of all of the reporting on kind of behaviors and practices, then we could probably come up with better whys. But I think the field lacks, you know, I've reported on this in a number of ways, the field lacks data. The field lacks information in order to really aggregate theoretically. So that's a problem. It's really hard to publish in a journal without some kind of theoretical structure.
Why do you think that is? I mean, sense of what you're saying. If we had more studies that looked at, you know, what's happening, I think maybe even in the description, there's a bit of theory going on there. But even in that sense, understanding what happened is enough for a publication. And then if we had enough of these, we could probably have better whys, as, like you said, analogous to like biology. Why are we so impatient in management studies, entrepreneurship studies? We want to know the answer in the paper, basically.
Yeah, I think it's how everyone grew up with this requirement that there always be a why and that there always be some theoretical contribution. I mean, it's in almost all of the major management journals that, you can't just describe, you have to have some kind of theoretical contribution. And I don't know, I would love to see a journal take more of a risk to say we're going to publish more descriptive pieces without this strong, theoretical orientation towards the front. Now I could see, part of the story is that we're trying to dialogue, this is the other thing that I'm kind of always soapboxing about, which is that, we're always in dialogue with other colleagues. What makes our writing different as academics compared to other kinds of writers and communicators is that we're writing to a very specific group of people. And that group of people is our citation list. When I'm writing, when I cite someone, I'm basically in relationship to that person and saying, well, here's how I'm responding through my research to your ideas. So I think some of it has to do with that. But, I would make that cleaner and just say, at the front, there's kind of not a if then, there's not all these whys. To me, it could just be a dialogue to say, this is what we already know. And so here's where I'm entering the room to make this contribution in terms of what I'm contributing to other people's work. And that could be enough. But it would be great too, just to have more description. But again, better minds than I need to figure out how to do that. And the journal editors, I think, need to step up. But, my sense is the EAP part, but also, SAP and all of the practice-oriented groups, I think, are challenging kind of the need to always have some major theoretical why in it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. Now that we're on this topic, sorry, if anybody else wants to jump in, please do so. I'll just say one thing. A friend of mine's a biologist, actually, since we were talking about biology. And his research is, on a species of bird and like nesting behavior. And they go years of data collection to do different things. There is a bit of an experimental angle because they want to know about not just describing the nesting behavior. There's a lot of descriptions already, but they want to know a little bit more about certain aspects. I don't know all the details, but you can imagine that they kind of want to know a little bit more experimental insights. But it's not an experiment in the a quantitative sense of an experiment. It's more of what happens with this specific nesting pair if this thing is changed. They want to know a little bit about how the behavior kind of adjusts. And they're not going to win a Nobel Prize. The theoretical contribution in terms of from management study or entrepreneurship studies looking at this, I'm like, you're never going to be able to come up with some kind of grand theoretical explanation. But that's just okay. That's not an expected aspect. That's not really his job in that sense. It's just doing the studies well is the main point.
And they could spend years doing it, and they're paid to spend years doing it, and they have the luxury of spending years doing it. So, that aspect of field work is really, really critical. And it just seems the management field in general has less luxury for its faculty just to hang out and be around entrepreneurs for years and say, I hung around some entrepreneur for 5 years and this is what I learned. And
yeah,
it's hard. It's
Tom,
hard.
You had your hand raised. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, just a couple of reflections because I think it's quite interesting points here. So first, I think we can definitely bring up this topic concerning the journal editors on our panel discussion on Wednesday. So I think we might raise this point, like who of you is daring enough to maybe tune down the need for a theoretical contribution? At the same time, I think if we look at where entrepreneurship is now and the papers that are coming out, there is also an inherent benefit of using practice theories, because practice theory is not about individual behavior. It's about how do individuals act in their given context, and how is that maybe a patterned way of doing things. So I think practice theories are very good at explaining entrepreneurship as a social phenomenon. And there have been so many calls for this to really understand what is entrepreneurship seeing it as a social phenomenon, not an individual, not a regional one, but as a social thing, how people interact and do things together across time. And it's such a powerful approach to understand why certain contexts develop these inherent understandings and way of doing entrepreneurship, and how they might differ from one another, and how, you know, networking for entrepreneurs is different in Germany compared to the US, which has huge differences there, as recent research has found. And that's what's exciting about this as well, I think.
Yeah.
And I think, especially as PhD students, I mean, we are now complaining about not having the time to do the field work. But if you're at a university that gives you enough time for your PhD, you do have the time to collect this great data. And I think that's one of the beauties, that you ideally you get the time to collect the data. You can spend time in the field. And I think that's also something for you to cherish. So practice theory and being a PhD student, it's a good combination, I think.
I agree. You know, but here's one of the challenges of fieldwork, though, is that the kind of where entrepreneurship happens, and the ability to kind of follow and observe, you know, where what's going through my mind is, so, you know, let's say one's interested in pitching and selling one's idea, and or even asking for help. So, you know, we typically, our studies of pitching have been individuals who are in pitching competitions, and they kind of pitch to, let's say, an angel investor group or someone else. And so we're in a particular location and we watch that there. But, you know, my sensibility about entrepreneurship is there's just so much outside of other venues where, you know, now, one of my favorite stories is, I had an entrepreneur. I mean, this is many, many years ago when there was just lots of ways to do things, but I had an entrepreneur that used to work in New York City, and he would take the train in every day, and every day he'd sit next to a different person and they'd strike up a conversation about what he was up to, and he actually trying to finance a new venture. And so on the train, he basically used the train to raise money. You know, within about a year, he had enough people that were interested in an idea, because he'd sit with someone every day, that he could have this finances to go forward. So, you know, kind of pitching on a train. So if I was observing that process, I'd have to hang around the train every day with him. So, you know, there are some challenges about where people are doing what they're doing, and how we have somewhat limited capabilities of paying attention to where those spaces are. So, and I think too, this is an issue that I'm intrigued with, is kind of space and place, and how space and place plays out in kind of practice. So anyway, you know, it's just such a rich area. And I think too, the nice thing about entrepreneurship right now is it's just so open. I'll babble on about a couple of other things. You know, one of the, I mean, so in my lifetime, in kind of my academic career, about 40 years, we've seen entrepreneurship go from basically, if you were writing in, you know, Entrepreneurship Theory and Practices, American Journal of Small Business, and there was a new journal in 1985 called Journal of Business Venturing. They were zero journals. They had really no citation power. And, you know, you kind of wondered, well, why should I publish in a journal that has kind of zero rankings? But the goal of the group, the people that were in entrepreneurship, was to make these journals 4-star journals and to move them forward. And so now institutionally, you know, these journals are in some ways more, in quotes, in terms of citations, powerful than the established journals like Administrative Science Quarterly. If you've read any of the editorials by the editor of ASQ, he's always flabbergasted and complains about the fact that these entrepreneurship journals have higher citation power than ASQ. And I would say the reason for it is that the entrepreneurship area is a very open community. It prides itself in welcoming others intellectually and also personally. It's a very personable group. You know, we like new people, and part of, I think, the intellectual reason for that is, you know, in entrepreneurship, I think our strategy is that everything's a win-win, and we can always make the pie bigger. And I think in a lot of other fields in the management area, there's the sense that the intellectual space is limited and you have to kind of compete for it. And that in many ways, ASQ has always been a club of very limited number of individuals. So, the fact that we're expansive gives people opportunities to come and make contributions. And it shows in our citation rankings. But, that took 40 years to make happen. So, and I guess one other thing. So what that says is the institutional structure of the field is not fixed. And one of the things I always ask everyone is you have to realize, we have a number of 4-star journals, JBV, ETP, and maybe Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal and a few others. But other journals could certainly be 4-star if you read and write to them. What makes a journal a 4-star journal is that people cite articles in that journal. So, there's no reason why we couldn't have IGEBRA, the International Journal of Entrepreneurial Behavior and Research, and let's say Small Business Economics and Entrepreneurship and Regional Development be 4-star journals. If you're reading and writing into them, if you're citing them, then they'll become 4-star journals. And that's really up to the field to say, we really care about these journals enough to read and write into them, that we could have a dialogue with that journal and other journals, and it'll work. And I'll give you an example of that. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, right now I'm in the family entrepreneurship area. So I'm looking at how families as teams act entrepreneurially. And the major journal in that area is Family Business Review. And why did it become a 4-star journal? Because it had a very conscious dialogue for literally 20 years with entrepreneurship and theory and practice. ETP had a special issue every year that dialogued with FBR that created citations between the two journals, and FBR cited ETP. And I'll give you an anecdotal story. Many years ago, I'd gone to Ray Bagby, who had been editor of ETP for years. And, as kind of like, I would say, a pure play entrepreneurship person, I said, why are you doing this special issue in family business? It's just like, it doesn't make any sense to me. It's not kind of necessarily entrepreneurial, it's succession and a whole bunch of other stuff. It's hard for me to see the connection. So, why? That's a lot of pages for a journal to focus a special issue every year on that topic. And he turned to me and said, Bill, that's our most cited issue. He says, the reason why ETP actually has citation power is because FBR cites it. And, that's how FBR became such a leader. So it's always readers and writers cross-reading in. And I also remember JBV, when Ian McMillan was editor, would go to the editorial meetings and to all the people in the entrepreneurship division and say, your obligation is basically to have 2 articles, one that's in JBV every year, one that's in JBV and one's in another journal. And each article should cite each other. If we're in this, again, it's always about co-citations across the journals that creates journal power. So, you have to think about where your dialogue is across journals and how you're going to make that happen. And as a community, I think the entrepreneurship division has shown how much kind of intellectual power we can have because we're so open and we're willing to kind of have everyone win and to create winners in the journals, for example. So, the field's not fixed. There's not a limited number of 4-star journals. You can grow it. And as the field grows, we need more 4-star venues. So, that's your goal. Where are your 4-star journals? Who do you want in the next 5 years to make a journal a 4-star journal?
That's a really nice way to think about things. And also I'm thinking too, it's going back to practice theories, you said the institutionalization of the field isn't set. It is reproduced, and there's some reasons for that reproduction, but that doesn't mean that you have to, well, I guess depending on your own position, also play a role in reproducing the certain journal rankings. But there's an alternative route.
Yeah,
and something new, like you're trying to mention. I mean, it's analogous to entrepreneurs, right, in the field. It's not that much different, to be honest. There's a lot of it's different in many respects, but it's not that different in some respects. And in this way, you can see your industry is institutionalized and fixed, or and you can play along in that game and try to compete within that, or you can try to do something different and develop and create a whole new domain. And there's these choices that we have to make, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the struggle always, certainly kind of critical entrepreneurship theory, the issues are, so what is I'll just say the level of agency that's possible. I think everyone can criticize certain times there's a fantasy that entrepreneurs are the 100% agents of their situation, and that they can kind of control whatever happens. And I would say there's certainly a reasonable pushback to say, well, no, entrepreneurs are in this particular institutional environment. They're constrained by what they can do and how they can do it, and we need to pay attention to that. But again, yeah, I would say, what's so cool is, yes, there's an institutional framework that occurs now. But, if we can take a longer time period, you can change almost all of that. That I think that's what my takeaway as an entrepreneurship academic is that, you start with 0-star journals, and then after a while, if the community is conscious of where they're going, you have 4-star journals, and everyone's a win. And I think a lot of other fields have been baffled by that. I mean, in one sense, think about it. 40 years ago, entrepreneurship kind of comes out of nowhere. The story I tell about my career is I had a chance to go to schools that were very, very strong, Columbia, and working with Peter Drucker at Claremont on strategy. And, to choose entrepreneurship, one of my mentors came to me after I made the decision to work with Carl Vesper and be in entrepreneurship and said, "You've ruined your career. There's no future in entrepreneurship." What are you doing, Bill? The reality of where business is corporate strategy, and you've got great opportunities to go to great schools, and now you're going to do this entrepreneurship thing. He was crestfallen, but that was then, and it's not now.
You're doing something innovative when at least one person tells you you're crazy.
Well, but sometimes
Nobody tells you you're
really
crazy, you're probably
stupid
not.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, so there's certain risk involved, but I think too that the issue is we're much larger agents in our lives as academic than you necessarily think. Things aren't fixed, and you're going to be, it's true. I've got you for an hour, so I can just wander about. One of the things too in doctoral consortiums I always say is, look to the left of you and look to the right to you. Now, usually what that means for the Marines and the military is, people on the left or right of you are going to be gone, and it'll only be you. But in entrepreneurship and in academics, look to the left of you and look to the right of you and realize those people are going to be around you for your entire career. They're not going anywhere. They're going to be in your life. And so if they're going to be in your life, you better get to know them, know what they're up to, and be supportive and helpful as you move forward. So it's to me, I think we've tried to preach, this is a very generous area of research. I think, it's very collegial. People realize there's lots of wins. And so, everyone in the room right now and online, we're all colleagues, and there's ways to support each other. And the field's not limited, it's not a kind of a closed thing. So given that, try to support each other. This isn't a group to make enemies. It's a way to make friends and develop relationships and colleagues, and you're going to be with them for a long time.
If nobody wants to say anything, I have more questions.
Okay. We'll have a dialogue until people raise their hand.
Yeah. You mentioned at one point that it's important to be in the field. And that's still quite a challenge, right? For most scholars is to actually get time and be in the field. Because I think there's quite some people that have legitimacy and careers in our field that don't really that they aren't in the field. You know what I mean? So what would your advice be to people that want to be in the field and be taken seriously at the same time?
I think you've got to make it a habit. So, part of it is, so some of my EAP junior colleagues just spend a certain, I would say it this way. You have to make very conscious choices about where you put your time. So field work is a part of the research process, and you just have to allocate a certain amount of hours to it. Now, it could be every day, it could be once a week, it could be you're spending 2 days a month, or you spend your summer going a particular place. But my challenge, my life now is kind of a senior scholar, is mostly just writing and less field work, or just kind of even doing the research, and mostly just kind of writing and thinking with other people. So but my challenge to everyone is that the research process takes a vast amount of time. And my heuristic is, and I've kind of talked to everyone about this, and I've looked at my own behaviors, and I would say that a A-level journal article of getting in a 4-star journal requires 1,000 hours, 1,000 hours. And that's not even the research part. That's just kind of like the writing and thinking and just kind of being in that article. So from the moment I have an idea to kind of like getting it published will be about 1,000 hours. So that's a half a year of someone's life. That's a lot of time. A person year is basically 2,000 hours. So that's a full half a year. It's half a day every day for an entire year. And frankly, there's no way to get out of it. I don't know anyone who's been able to do it. You can split the time with a number of other people, but there's 1,000 hours involved. And so, academics is very time intensive, and you all have to do teaching. Many of you have service responsibilities, and that just eats away from that 1,000 hours. And so, I can say, and as a writer, not just as a researcher, but I was very conscious about, I took that 1,000 hours seriously long ago, and I never met with anyone to do academic stuff at school, when I was at Georgetown or USC or the other places. I never met with anyone to do that kind of stuff, teaching, until afternoon, after lunch. So I always had my mornings free to write, and I was very disciplined about it. And it was a fight because, a lot of people are morning people and they want to meet with you for breakfast or have a morning meeting, but I never did. So I think for the research thing and for field work, it's just this issue of having the discipline to say no to a lot of people. And that's always, there's some conflict there, but I think you have to be open with your careers to say, the goals of my institution are this, and in order to satisfy those goals, I need a certain amount of time. So, I can't do committee work every day for 4 hours. I need to be in the field and I need to be writing. So, making that commitment's a hard commitment, because the one other thing about this is the short term always drives out the long term. Okay. The immediate, like my teaching, has a tendency to drive out anything that may take 2 years of my effort for now. So, I try to always have that in the back of my mind. I have a list of activities, and I try to not make the short term, my priority. I try to make my long term the priority, but that's really hard. So I don't think it's, I can say these things and say, but they're never easy. Those are really hard choices, and there's a lot of conflict involved because the short term just always demands your immediate attention. People want you to do this now. Well, why aren't you on this committee? We need to have you here. Or, there's always teaching issues, but you've got to just push that to a particular point to get your research done. You have to make your research a priority. And that's hard. So, sorry.
Nobody said it was going to be easy, right?
Yeah, no, I wish it was more a luxury, but I think really is this prioritization is you wear as an academic multiple hats. I would say in one sense, no matter where I've been, I've always been paid to teach. I'm almost always at a private school, and the private schools, make their money from tuition revenue or from endowment, but for the most part, for having students in a classroom that I'm teaching. So, they look and go, we need to have these number of bodies, and you need to pay attention to make those students happy. So that pays my salary. But, what interests me is my research and kind of trying to think through certain kinds of problems. So, but I've just got to carve out time for that, make it a priority. It's hard. It's never been easy. Always conflict. So I hope I haven't gotten too off the topic.
No, it's all relevant, I think.
Orla, your hand's up.
Oh,
Hi, Bill. Thanks for this. It's really interesting. I think it's so lovely to hear you share your experiences, and we're just really lucky to have your part of today. I wanted to ask about practice studies more kind of specifically, and I was wondering, what do you look for in a practice study? So a few people have mentioned, they're deep in the field, they've loads of data. We had a discussion, about theory and the journals looking emphasis on theorizing. But for you, what would a good practice study look like? Or and if you wanted to drop in a few a few of the go-to authors for practice research that you think would be compatible or important for practice researchers to use or refer to or to cite. So what would make a good practice study for you, I guess?
Well, first of all, we've had a number of really good special issues. So, there's a special in ERD that is just really beautiful. And then there was a special in special issue in algebra. So there's a lot of good empirical work on both those special issues. The kind of, God, there's just a lot of stuff. So, I could probably put out a list of that, and I think we've got a list on the EAP website of really cool stuff. So, you're going to hear standard Nicolini, Shotsky for certain kind of theoretical ways to go about some of this. And I think Sarah's on the line today. Sarah Elias is doing some really beautiful stuff. So, but most of this people in the room who are kind of senior people have been doing good stuff. So it's out there. I think I fall back on a certain number of different tropes for thinking about how to do research, even practice theory research. I always fall back on Murray Davis's article, That's Interesting, published in 1971 in a very obscure journal. But the idea of That's Interesting is that in the academic community, some things are more publishable than others because of their level of interest to other individuals. And so, typically, there's if you merely do research on what's obvious, what people already know, well, it doesn't get published because this has been the challenge of replication studies. Even though replication is really, really, really valuable and we need to have follow on, it's really hard to get them published. And part of it is because replication is for many people not interesting. It just merely duplicates what we already know. So, in That's Interesting framework, it's like, well, if you publish what other people already know, it's not interesting. It won't get published, which is a challenge if you're replicating, finding a journal that it wants that. But then on the other side, it's like, if you're doing something that's basically so radically different from everything that other people know and so crazy making, then people are going to say that's absurd. It doesn't make any sense at all. And basically in the middle is this issue of That's Interesting, that it's basically a commentary on, we all know that the phenomenon is B, but when I went out into the field, I found that it looks like A. So it's kind of like maybe a B, not B, but A is different than B. And that's what we find interesting in scholarship is that, people who tend to get published are able to say, and that's your dialogue with your other colleagues, is to say, I'm laying a groundwork to say, this is what I believe everyone knows about how people raise money. And actually, when I went out into the field, I found that it's different than that. And that's what's interesting. It's like, oh, well, I thought, I think this has been, the thing that's been fun over the last 5 years is this long dialogue between a number of people about, I was on an article with Frederica Velder and Baker and Ostrich on kind of mundane entrepreneurship. And, the idea of that is that, we tend in the journals to think that, all high growth and all interesting things only happen with venture capital based firms. So then we only look at how people raise money from venture capital. But, 90% of all money that's given to entrepreneurs is given to mundane entrepreneurs. And so maybe we need to look at, how do people raise money from other people that are not venture capitalists? So, that's a not A. It basically says, we've thought about venture capital financing, and there's a journal on, things like that. But maybe we need to know way more about how you just get money from someone on the street or your friends or your family. How does that work? So to me, that's kind of the really cool part of where I think practice is that we're, there's just been this orientation towards high growth, gazelles and stuff. And I think practice theory can really make a major contribution to saying entrepreneurship happens in all these different contexts. Why don't we look at it? In many ways, it's very different about how people get stuff done. So
it also helps us tackle that big problem of diversity, right? I think that was also one of the papers that you wrote, that entrepreneurial phenomenon, there's so much diversity, right? So if you go to a setting that's not entrepreneurial, let's say a doctor's office, people that do practice-based studies in doctors' offices have the luxury that it's quite a routine interaction that doctors have with patients, what they do in their doctor's office. There's quite some variation still within their practices that it's interesting, but there's a lot of routineness, and the place itself is also quite routinely used in the same way. Entrepreneurship studies, we don't quite have this luxury in the sense that the routineness of gaining funding doesn't happen in the same sorts of locations, the same style offices. Well, actually, I would say we have no idea because we hardly ever, like you said, gather enough in-depth data. So we have a lot of suspicions, but actually none of us actually know anything.
well, and actually, one of the things I think that plays out with, and I know Thomas, you've got your hand up, so we'll get to it in a second, is I think there's huge value in autoethnography. And, basically, in one sense, we can study ourselves in many ways. I mean, we're intellectual entrepreneurs, so we could look at how we initiate new ideas and play them out. But, there are a number of people in the field who are starting things and organizing in certain kinds of ways. For example, Bengt Johannessen's written a lot about his own experiences as an entrepreneur organizing in Växjö, Sweden. And, a lot of that's in Swedish, so it's hard to kind of grasp, but, I think there's ways to do that. If you want, you could actually organize, have that experience and write about it. And then you get, because you're writing about yourself, you can collect data wherever you go because you are you. And, I think it'd be really cool if we saw more of that. I was really happy when Kim Poldner, published her autoethnographic stuff in our research book on that area. But I think there's real power there. So you can be your own site of study. And Thomas, you've got your hand up. Your thoughts?
Yes, I completely agree with your autoethnography part. I mean, I started my own company last year, and I'm just taking notes, and if you're part of this process of organizing something, you almost don't need to collect data because the data collect itself, especially if you work with someone who's at the other end of the world and you have to use sort of digital media to communicate. And you're almost as if you're transcribing everything you're already doing. I would like to go back though to another part, and it's that's interesting part. So my question is, what would you tell PhD students if they at the end of the day come back and say like, well, I've spent half a year in the field, but I don't really see a lot that's interesting?
That would always surprise me if that I think one of the fundamental characteristics of academic scholarship is curiosity. So I in my own situations, I couldn't imagine that.
Because I mean, to some extent, it's something that I've experienced in my PhD work. So when I did my data collection, I came back and I sat in front of the desk and I was going through the data, and I'm still struggling to get this published, the research published, because it almost feels to me as I have to suck the interestingness out of the data. It's not like it's there screaming into my face. I almost have to frame it, to phrase it in a particular way to say like, look, this is what's interesting about my data.
Yeah, and I had the different dilemma. I was tasked to do data collection on a particular kind of problem, and found, my original research is actually on this diversity thing. I have an Academy article in 1985, prehistoric times, on kind of a framework for thinking about entrepreneurship. But that was because my data was so all over the place. I was just like, because at that point, the field was saying, well, there's just kind of like the entrepreneurial type. And it's like, well, no, my data, I talked to hundreds of people and they were just all over the place. Tall ones and short ones. And, every kind of person was being involved in it. Just like, well, no, this doesn't make any sense to me. So just trying to manage that and actually provide a framework for how to do that just took years. So yeah, I don't know. I'm always curious about, something happens and it doesn't make any sense to me. And that's why I do research on it. So interesting that you have that experience. Yeah. Interesting. So I saw another hand up, but I don't know where it went. It kind of went up and then went down.
I think there's a lot of, practice-based studies is analysis and examination and explanation of everyday life in one sense. And everyday life is, even for us, because we're people, we take a lot for granted. And it may not seem interesting in the first moment you look at it because it's like, oh, well, that's just what it is. But actually, if you get in the mindset of why is it like that, then you start to understand it could be different, but everybody is doing it this way. Or, what's going on here? Why does it have to be like this? What is the logic? What is the practical logic that's going on here? And that, when you start to see that, then you realize, wow, this is super interesting, because this is something that everybody understands and agrees with and shares and does. And, but nobody talks about, that nobody is vocalizing. And I think that's, when you get to that point in your research and your data, it's extremely interesting. The matter then is trying to communicate that interestingness to the reader to get them beyond the taken for granted.
Yeah, and I would add, long ago, I remember, we can make this the motto for almost a lot of different fields, but I remember it as a motto for one sociologist saying that, that person's motto was make it strange. That this everyday aspect of things, if you think about it, invariably is unique to that situation. It's strange in its own odd way, and that we have to pay attention to why it's different and how it's different, and put some energy into that. And it's, I'm always baffled by why people do what they do. And so it's fascinating.
Pitching on the train is a good one, actually.
Yeah, there's just
you took that seriously as a case, and I don't know how, but you had some data, let's say, about that. Even if it was just happened once, it'd be really interesting to try to figure out how is this different than the more routinized way of doing pitching and with audiences and things. And what's going on? That would be really interesting.
Yeah, but also just, I think, it'd be fascinating. And it's not necessarily a practice-based study in the sense you wouldn't necessarily follow people around, but just ask people, so where did you get your money? How did it work? What'd you do? Or if you're getting money now, can I hang out when you're going to go ask for money? It's a very personal thing to kind of go out and have a meeting with someone and ask where you're going, but it's all doable. And again, it's a whole bunch of hanging around. That's always the fun. I think about, I think a lot about kind of how the structures of things work. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of academic entrepreneurship. So I did a special issue long ago on kind of what the field was about, kind of bibliometrics thinking about entrepreneurship. But one of the articles that was really interesting by Reeder and Watkins was, so Diane Reeder had an interesting idea for a dissertation, and that was kind of what's the social relationships, personal social relationships of citations. And the broad question was, so do the people who cite each other know each other? And how close are they? And there's actually is there a correlation between the number of citations that, let's say, a pair has and their closeness, how well they know each other? So she kind of did a bibliometric analysis of the field, but then sent questionnaires to all the people that were in the kind of bibliometric thing. There's always that framework, and then said, so how well do you know these people? And the answer was, most people who cite each other know each other fairly well. You cite who you know, because usually you know people that you're reading. So it's kind of a very personable reading and writing thing. And to me, that article should have been to the field and to people practicing in the field is, if you want to know and be known, if you want to know others and for the others to be known, You actually have to show up. It's the Woody Allen line, 80% of success in life is just showing up. And so, going to conferences, hanging out, that's really key to your career, is having other people know you and know your work. And typically that knowing your work happens a couple of ways, but I'm seeing a lot of people are very conscious about that. They send their work to other people. They hang around at conferences. The whole point of going to a conference is to pitch your ideas and people get to know them. So, that social process, that's academic practice. We could say academics is practice, AAP. Is a lot of what entrepreneurs are doing. How do you get your ideas out? And so actually someone could probably write about that. They could write about, well, how did I get this paper published? And how did I get people to value this idea and make it worthwhile? As an aside, I've spent a lot of time with Saras Rasuvathy. And, I'm just always intrigued with the nature of how effectuation became what it was. And we've talked a lot about, how do you attract individuals to where you're going, or do you attract at all? Because she's been very conscious of using an effectual model for building the EAP field. So it's very different than how I go about stuff. I see a hand there. Rohan, you've got your hand up.
Hi, great conversation. So I just wanted to pick up on one thing that was mentioned earlier as well, that the field is new and there are, I think, many areas to explore. That's, I think, one of the reasons why you were mentioning it's open. But when you're writing, let's say, a paper which has new data, you're trying to show something new empirically. When you look at it theoretically, you might find that because there is a lot of practice theory, sort of knowledge and perspectives that are still not brought to entrepreneurship. We have discussed a lot of them. Let's say the literature review in ERD discussed a whole bunch of approaches, but there is still a lot in practice theory that has not been sort of applied. So the problem we are currently facing is we are seeing something interesting theoretically. We are seeing something beyond what entrepreneurship as practice has talked about on the theoretical side. There is something interesting to present on the data side. There are shifts happening from studying individual entrepreneurial behavior to collective behavior. So there are a lot of shifts happening in the field together, and there are a lot of open areas. So I'm just curious to know your thoughts on, and it's also kind of related to Orla's question, which is more practical, which is on how do you think about writing one paper or multiple papers out of a context where you see multiple things coming out. So can't put everything in one paper. So how do you see this?
Well, and you're really right about that. One of the things I think is really critical is to realize, at least for academic journal articles, you're a short story writer. You're not a novelist. You can include lots of different things. Journal articles have to tell one story, and it has to be very concrete. It can't float over all kinds of other ideas. That, for a lot of scholars, takes a lot of practice. So I am not a novelist. I'm a short story writer. It's a very specific kind of genre. And, the part and parcel, well, I think a couple things you're kind of touch on. One is that I actually think it's advantage to think about the fact that, and this was something I learned from Howard Aldrich long ago. He said, one of the things that a lot of scholars get in trouble about is they go from interesting to interesting idea in different kinds of topic areas and think about it. In order to kind of get at a level where you can publish something interesting in a journal, it takes about a year of kind of literature review just to really know that area really, really well. So, if you think about, if you're shifting topics, you're basically saying, I'm going to spend another year looking at a different literature. So, his advice, which I took seriously, was to say, when you think about what you're doing, think about it in 5 to 10 year chunks, that you're going to create a research program on a particular idea. And let's say it could be an EAP. First of all, I'm going to have a site that I'm going to look at and interact with for the next 5 years. So I've got data collection going on, and I'm going to kind of focus my data collection on a particular kind of setting, and so say some individuals. And for there, I'm going to develop a program. And let's say if I'm at a setting, then I could say, well, one thing I'm interested in is, the interrelationships. Like, for example, right now in my family entrepreneurship stuff, I'm really fascinated with who's a helper. And so we're looking at, the whole problem of who's a founder and who's not a founder and how family members help each other. So we're kind of hanging out with families to see how help happens. And and it's an interesting challenge about how help and founding works. So, I've got a 10-year plan, frankly, of kind of what I'm doing my basic research on, because I know that just kind of being in that area just sucks up a lot of time to understand what other people have said about it. Well, I'll even give you an example. When I went to Babson, so I'm kind of just a individual entrepreneurship person for the most part, think about things that way. So I was invited into this chair on family entrepreneurship, and part of the agreement with them is I said, look, I know nothing about families, and I don't nothing about family business, and there's a huge literature on that for 20 years. And so frankly, you have to think of me as a doctoral student for the first 3 years. I'm going to spend my time really learning what the family business literature is, how they think about family entrepreneurship, and what's been said. And I told him, I said, in about 3 years, I'll have something to say, but I'm clueless now. And that was kind of like really stunned him. But I said, I started June 1st, 2017. And I said, don't expect anything from me for the next 3 years. Around 2020, I'll start to publish. But, I've got to get up and, that's just as you a doctoral students. No one says the first day you're a doctoral student, well, are you going to have a publication done in 3 months? I doubt it. Just kind of get to know the literature and what people are doing, and how they go about it. Just takes a long time. It's developing that craft. So, it took me 3 years to get anything out in family entrepreneurship. Still been slow. So, I think that same way when you're building your career. It's just, think in terms of 5 and 10-year chunks, and then kind of figure out where the synergies are going to be. And there'll be some surprises about where you go. And you can write on that, but kind of stay in a place, hang out there.
This is super important. I think the second thought that I had is very closely related to what you mentioned, which is about methodology, right? So doing purely inductive work versus, let's say, work that is abductive, you collect data, you theorize, you collect data because it's little more efficient, or whether you understand the literature better. So this kind of, staying in one place, do you think it's more suited to kind of an abductive method rather than a purely inductive one, where you really look at the surprises and then go wherever the data is taking you in terms of literature?
Yeah, there's a larger investment of time in the site you're in, and I think it tends to kind of inductive or abductive research. If I were to look at a model, he's not really, I don't think he would call himself a practice person, but if you look at someone who tends to take a long time to develop interesting ideas, is Ted Baker. So, if you look at Ted, it took him a long, so if you look at Ted, and a couple of other things too, and sorry to bounce around a bit, it's well worth looking at someone's CV and just to get a handle on kind of where they've gone and why they've done what they've done. So let's take Ted Baker. So, Ted comes out of Howard Aldrich's shop at UNC, and he does some stuff with Howard on some interesting things. But, Ted gets his legs and movement when he goes to Wisconsin. And he's working with Ann Miner, and they're looking at improvisation and how people improvise. And so Ted kind of gets a sense of how improvisation works in organizations with Ann, and they write a few things. But, it's from there that, he develops this whole idea of bricolage, and takes, Levi Strauss's ideas about bricolage and basically looks at entrepreneurs to say, they kind of take what they have and recreate and make something work. So that took a long time. That came out of his improvisational struggles with Ann, and then kind of moved into this idea of, well, it's a reconfiguration. It's kind of an improvisation of resources, this idea of bricolage. That was an ASQ piece. It took about 3 or 4 years to kind of make it work. And then, after that, then, at NC State, he had a chance to work with Aaron Powell. And actually, Aaron was out of textiles area. And, that led to some other things about kind of the interactions of other individuals and how that whole process works, the nature of entrepreneurial identity. And, there was just a huge amount of struggle and stuff to kind of make that work. And then, that's another ASQ piece. So, Ted tends to take a long time, 3 to 5 years in a particular area, digging around. and then comes up with really cool stuff that has, I think, real intellectual power. So, you know, you can think about when you're in the field, I think you just generate really powerful stuff. But, you know, it's a 5-year play. And then you've got to think about, you know, what kind of truths you generate out of that. Yeah, look at Ted's stuff. I think Ted's got a certain lifestyle and way of, I think, making major contributions. You know, Ted doesn't write a huge amount, but I always respect what he does. It's really beautiful. Other thoughts?
I have another question if nobody else has one.
I do have
Go
a
ahead.
question. I was also quite intrigued by the thing you said about observing pitching in the train and how to follow certain practices. And I was wondering how, so pitching is like a very obvious practice. And for example, filling in a business model canvas is also an obvious practice. But how do you know if something is a practice and what is not a practice? Like, what are the boundaries of a practice?
Huh.
Because I also have the impression like a lot happens in between. Like when we think about entrepreneurship, it's easy to think about pitching, but there are so many things that happen in between. How do you know which of these things are important?
Well, I think that's kind of the fun of it. I think what's interesting and intriguing is, you know, I look at the nature of practices coming out of a field where, you know, strategy and other areas where, you know, the idea was dependent on thinking about routines, that a practice was a set of routines. And if we hung around a person, we could see how this practice continued on. And then maybe if you were interested in how that practice got transferred through some kind of learning device to other people. You know, you can also think, you know, there's a similarity with Wenger's issues on communities of practice. So, you know, so what is it? You're right. So what is a practice and how does it kind of how do we behave in relationship to it? You know, I think that's what makes entrepreneurship, I think, kind of an interesting area, but also different than strategy or stuff in organization or innovation, is that, you know, I think entrepreneurs are learning certain kinds of practices as they go about it. And then they make them more, well, you know, in my own academic life, in order to get certain things done, I've had to pitch for money. I've had to go to foundations and government agencies and tell them a story about why they should give me a bunch of money to do research. And, you know, I've always had a saying that, you know, to figure out that routine in my own life usually takes about 40 times. I have to tell that story 40 times in order for someone to go, you know, that we talk about elevator pitches and, you know, to actually consciously be able to tell people what I'm trying to do in a way that they'll go, oh, that is so cool, I'm going to give you money. It just takes a lot of time to do. And so I'm fascinated with that. And that's why I'm thinking in some ways, you know, some of the better stuff's probably going to come out autoethnography, in the sense that, you know, I should probably be learning about how I went about perfecting my pitch to get people to give me money. But I think if you were looking at pitching over time, that would be fascinating to see how an entrepreneur gets better at offering a way to get resources from other people. That, and I could say actually, you know, Saras, you know, again, Saras has done some really interesting things on this. She got a huge amount of money from American Express to kind of look at effectuation practices in emerging businesses. And her conclusion is that the critical aspect to success was how people ask for help. And that she's been writing now for the last 2 years on the ask. How do you ask people? And what does that framework look like? So there's a wonderful article in Negotiation Journal on, it's somewhat on negotiation, but it's really a framework for asking people for help. And what does an effectual ask look like? What does a pitch look like? What does a quid pro quo look like? And to realize that in certain situations, you ask in different ways for different things. So, you know, that's one framework for it. But I think it's just the beginning of a whole bunch of ways to think about how do we get help from other people.
As a practice theorist, I have to point out that, yes, this is definitely the case, becoming better at it, but that's also only because it's in relation to the audience thinking it's becoming better. And so therefore, the person that's giving you the money has a lot of agency and a lot of expectations. And it's not so much that the entrepreneur becomes better in a full stop kind of way. It's that they become better at coming to an agreement about what expectations the listener has. So it's a relational phenomenon. And too often we remove the audience or the listener from active participation. And why can't the listener also, for example, if me personally went and listened to a bunch of pitches of entrepreneurs, I don't do this for a career, so I would have less experience in learning. Whereas if I was a venture capitalist where I hear 200 pitches, a year, I have a lot of experience in listening to pitches and what I'm listening for. So there's a lot of learning that happens also for the other side of the relationship. It's not only the entrepreneurs learning as they're doing, it's the listener, and it's in the form of relationship that they can come to an agreement. So I think that's the social part of social practices. We can be aware that we can always slip back into entrepreneurship as practice as being the entrepreneur's practice, whereas it's always a relational phenomenon.
Agreed. And then a couple of other things, because I do want to get back to that. So the genius of what happens here is that, so we're in a dialogue, and we're in one sense all becoming venture capitalists of ideas about the nature of entrepreneurship as practice. So the relationality that's happening here is really, really key. We can only build the field if we're all in some ways on the same page, that we all, if I say Shotsky, then you've read Shotsky, or if I've said Nicolini and what he's about, you've read Nicolini. So I'll tell you, when you're in the dialogue now, because, at the end of the day, as readers and writers, we're reading and writing in particular contexts. Those contexts happen to be journals. So, that's where we score points. So, given that, what the genius of this conference is that we're building up a community, because really the relationality is critical in academics of readers and writers to make that happen. So I keep pushing on that because I think it really is underappreciated about how important this is for making the field work. Because when you write to a journal, you have to have a set of reviewers who understand where you're coming from. Because if the reviewers don't, then, educating them is like a nightmare. You can't spend 12 pages telling people about the history of practice theory in order to get it in. You're writing a short story, you've got 20 pages, and you can only have a paragraph about kind of the context which you're writing from. So, you're going to be reviewers of other people's practice work, and other practice people who are in this room are going to review your stuff too. So this community is really key. Without the community, we would have gotten nothing published. That's always the critical aspect of kind of where you go. Entrepreneurs build community. That's our CVP. So I've kind of I've run out of time. I don't know what you're doing. I know you've got another structure, so I don't want to take into where you go.
Well, we have a break now, half an hour break, just because, online can be taxing for concentration, and we need coffee on our end too. So,
okay.
I think, unless somebody has another point or wants to add anything that's particularly pressing, there is a hand up, but I don't know if that was from earlier.
Rohan, do you want to say?
I think it might be here.
Okay.
Yeah, nothing pressing. Just
Okay.
had a point around, Neil was saying that, we don't highlight the social aspect, etc. And you also spoke about, you've looked at entrepreneurs as an individual. One of the challenges we are currently facing is that when you shift your focus from looking at the individual to, let's say, a community of other actors, the real doubt is, how do you tell the story? Because one story can be told from the individual's perspective, the entrepreneur's perspective. The other story can be told from the collective's perspective. And there is so whether you shift your focus to some other actor in the ecosystem altogether, or whether you tell a story, that is of the community, and on how much of that depends on the data. So I'm just curious about what you think.
I don't know. I think this will be kind of the part of the conversation now shortly, but I would say actually the aspect of what practice theory is about, and practice and the methodologies of practice is actually the point of focus is on the practice, because the practice itself is relational. So that I think is really the genius of practice theory, is to say we're focusing on practices which involve individuals and the context which they're in. But if we stay with the practice and make that kind of like the focus, then we can solve that kind of relational, individual, environmental, social process at the same time. But
Right.
that's it. So I want to let everyone have their break. I'm sorry I can't be there, but
Bill?
for sure,
Yeah,
for sure next year.
for sure next year. Great.
Okay,
Thank
I'm
you very
gonna be
much.
off.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Enjoy.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bill.
Thank you,
good
Bill.
to see you. Bye-bye.
All right, everybody, we'll take a break, half an hour. I'm just gonna leave the room open, just so feel free to come back 11:30.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Neil.
That's why clear.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm thinking next year.
Should we continue?
It's not
Yeah,
really-
certainly.
You ready? Okay.
Yep. You ready?
So
Your
I have just shared on the screen the actual organized questions for the PhD Q&A, because I figure this is just a conversation and we might go in different places, and it might be handy to have this up. And the highlighted ones are just something to start with, but honestly, all of the questions are super interesting.
Yeah. Also,
yeah.
sorry.
ahead.
No, I was going to say, yes. So also to say, when we were discussing and organizing the conference, our thinking was to see what questions the attendees have, that you have yourselves, and for the agenda to be driven from your needs. And I guess the questions are very useful, and we're going to use these as a trigger for conversation amongst the panel. But also we have huge knowledge in the room from all the attendees. So at any point, if you've got additional comments to make or suggestions, be sure to raise your hand, turn on your mic, or enter them into chat as well. So we're just structuring it this way in terms of the organizers having a conversation around this, but it's certainly meant as an inclusive participatory event. So please get involved yourselves as well.
Yeah, good. That's a good point, Orla. Just maybe going back to like community of practice, right? This is a collaborative learning session. I don't think anybody has like all the answers to these questions. So there might be multiple perspectives. And if we don't cover a certain perspective, somebody should definitely jump in and clarify that.
Yeah. The invite was there. If anybody wanted to forward any questions of things that they'd like to see discussed as part of the PhD day, and many of you contributed questions. They were super questions, and Sarah and Neil have organised them thematically and also highlighting the ones in particular that we'll be talking about. But if other questions arise and pop up, again, there's definitely flexibility in the schedule to discuss them. And if we even don't get around to them now, perhaps we can use them like we did earlier as fillers as we go throughout the day as well.
Yeah.
Will we start, Neil? Is that okay? Is everybody ready?
Yeah, I think so.
Super. Okay, so in terms of ontologically, somebody posted the question, I'm still sometimes struggling to understand what is a practice and what is not a practice. What are the boundaries of a practice? Super question, whoever sent that one. So who'd like to kick things off on that front? Thomas, will we go with you? Would that be okay?
Yes, I actually have I have drawn something up from when I first tried to make sense of practice arrangement bundles, as Schatzky calls them. So perhaps I can also share my screen. No, I cannot because you're still sharing. But I would like, if you can stop sharing for a second. I think that's the only one I prepared for, so to speak, actually. So I have this picture here, and I don't know if it makes sense, but Schatzky always talks about these practice arrangement bundles. right? So that means he sort of says there are two things. There are the practices and there are the material arrangements, and both together constitute the practice arrangement bundles. And for me, that is a way to make sense of what is a practice and what is not. So on the practice side, we have the activities, the what is going on. So people are engaging in sorts of activities. And then of course it becomes a bit blurry, right? So is me picking up a bottle of water a practice or an activity, or does it belong to some larger practice? So only looking by activities, we might not say this is a practice or not, because we are missing something. It might just be a set of activities, a chain of activities. So a practice also involves an understanding and the explicit rules and norms and the teleological structures, so the why. So, okay, maybe practice, maybe this is an action, picking up my bottle and trying to drink something out of it. But the overall teleological structure, why am I doing it, is sort of to keep me as a person running, right? To keep me hydrated, right? So you might say there it's part of a hydration practice or whatever. So maybe that's another way to look at this topic. But then again, we also need to put it into a place, and that's the material arrangements. So that's the actors, and that's me, I, the individual, and me as a role. So it's the I versus the self, so to speak, to some extent as well. So I am in a role as a conference organizer currently, but I am also not just a conference organizer, because there's 4 of us. I am the conference organizer, Thomas. So this also brings together. And when I perform a practice, it might look different than, for instance, when Neil performs a practice, or Sarah, or anybody else in the room. And then we have the arenas, and that's the where. So that's more really the material context that surrounds us, including the material artifacts and objects that are present. And all these together, I think you need to look at to say, as a researcher, this is a practice that I look at. So in a sense, it gives you a framework, and the others can then debate this point. But looking at these 4 things, what, why, who, and where, gives you a framework for you as a researcher to say, this is what I consider the practice of my study, or the practices that I focus on, right? And then it's still sort of, it doesn't necessarily answer the question, what are the boundaries of a practice, or what was the second one? Yeah, entirely, because you could still draw this larger and smaller, but that's a decision that you can do as a researcher, at least from my point of view, right? But you always need to think of, to include those 4 aspects, what, who, why, and where.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. Sarah, Neil, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? And perhaps even drawing on some of the questions here, like Hiko asks, do you need to focus on all of those aspects, or can you bracket out some of them?
I think it's sometimes necessary to bracket out some of the things, right? I think in some of our papers, we might want to focus a bit more on the material arrangements. I think that's perhaps, then we focus on how do changes in the material arrangements perhaps affect the other parts, but the focus is on the material arrangements. And in a similar way, we might also change some of the other aspects and then look at how does it affect the rest of the practice arrangement bundles. So yes, a focus is definitely smart to do. However, you as a researcher, before writing it down and making sense of it, I think you need to go through the thought process of understanding all of the 4 aspects, if that makes sense. Would you agree with that?
Sarah, what's coming to your mind?
I was actually just looking at a question in the chat, so I don't know if I'm actually answering what Thomas was saying, but I totally agree with what you're saying, Thomas, and like you were saying, like sometimes you're more focused on material practices, because that, you know, I always go back to my research question, right? And so what is it that you're trying to study, and just stay focused on that. Doesn't mean that you don't collect as much data as you can. That's what I did when I was on the field for my dissertation. I had no idea what I was doing, right? I think a lot of us are like that. So you just gather as much data as you can. I had a camera with me every time that I could record stuff. I did. And even nowadays, I'm actually writing a paper now that makes sense of a lot of that data from a different lens, with a different research question, with other co-authors too. So So just, I guess, as an aside, just collect as much data as you can. And then I was thinking about the question, does this presuppose that all practices have a level of conscious awareness? I think there is, and there could be a level of unconscious processes within practices, right? And again, if that is your part of your research question, I mean, mine was pretty broad, but it actually ended up taking me into some unconscious stuff. And so there's like, so the study was about studying co-creation and using an aesthetics lens to study the practices of entrepreneurs as they are co-creating aesthetic value with their customers. And there was a lot of something that I noticed on the video footage that I had later on, not in the field, but as I was reanalyzing things, like there's a lot of mirroring between customer and the artists that was making a custom product. I didn't have the tools to actually tease out the unconscious processes that were going on. So maybe this actually goes to the question earlier on about, I don't see anything in my data. Sometimes it helps to bring in a co-author that is actually distanced from the data, because sometimes we're so immersed. I was 11 months in the field. And so sometimes it was hard for me to see things. I had to distance myself a little bit. And as we were, I wrote my dissertation, of course, that was my work. But then as I started submitting to journals, reviewers start asking questions. Oh, this is very cool, like the embodied and unconscious processes. Can you tease that out? I'm like, I wish I could, right? But I didn't have all that knowledge. And, again, it goes back to the community as well, right? We all know different people with different backgrounds, different skills and theoretical knowledges. So I invited a co-author that had, knowledge in psychoanalysis and embodied aspects and unconscious from a psychoanalytic approach. And so she was really amazing at reanalyzing the data with me, like going back to the videos and then explaining, oh, this is a process of mirroring, it's unconscious, they're actually being in tune with one another. So I guess that's a long answer to your question, Osioma, about how there can be and there is, I think, unconscious processes within practices for sure.
So can you guys hear me? Because sometimes there's,
yes.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. So I guess the reason why I'm asking it, because I'm very new to this and I've been reading, but with the image that Thomas just presented about that there's these practices and within that there's activities and then there's the why, right? So is that why the purpose of them engaging in these activities, or is the why their own awareness of kind of like, and that's kind of what I was trying to understand, because you could be doing activities but not aware of the why or not aware of the purpose, or you're just doing them without a sense of purpose. So is that a practice or not?
I think that's exactly a practice, because that's oftentimes something I see is that the why is not conscious, right? You don't have to do things knowing that why you're doing them. I mean, I think when I think back about it, Bruce Teague, he's also a professor in the US who has been active in this group. And when I did my PhD workshop in just the opposition, he was talking about type 1 and type 2 behavior, right? So he was going back to this Kahneman analogy or this Kahneman logic. And most of the behavior that we engage in is unconscious. I mean, the reasons why we engage in it are unconscious. And I think that's pretty important to understand for entrepreneurs, because oftentimes, at least when we look at accelerators and incubators and the what's or haves of trying to manufacture the perfect entrepreneur, what they are trying to do is sort of to ingrain this understanding. And I think many entrepreneurs take it as granted and they just follow up doing the practices, to some extent adopting the whys without necessarily reflecting upon them, right? And we could take this as from a critical point of view, but we don't need to. So the understandings do not have to be conscious. That's at least my way of looking at it.
Super. Do you know what? I might move on to the second question, Neil, and direct that towards you. And then if there's something in addition to what we've discussed in the first question, we can come back to it. Is that okay? Because the second question, I think, picks up on some of all of this. And it's, can all practices be depicted as processes? And what are the core components of a process model? And I might throw in routines there as well, because we often hear about routines, processes, and practices. So Neil, would you like to share some thoughts on that question?
So all practices are processes, but the question was more about depiction of practices as processes. And depiction goes to the representation. And the representation is something that we do as scholars. So all practices are sequences of actions. They're carrying out of bodily activities. And by definition, they're a process. It's something that happens in time. So I would say that all practice theorists, doesn't matter which practice framework you take, they're all processual in that sense. Depiction as processes is maybe a more difficult thing to answer, because it depends on what you're after, what kind of research question you're trying to answer, and how much you want to depict this processual nature. What you could think about one way is a depiction as a representation through a vignette. And here you can tell a story of a single instance of, let's say, a pitch, because we're on pitching a lot, of what transpires over those moments. So the entrepreneur steps onto the stage, the audience takes their seats. He begins with these words, yada, yada, and there's some question and answer. And you can, through the vignette, you can show that there's a unfolding of this practice. That's one way of depiction. Again, I think it's important to understand as researchers, we're never going to be able to depict reality as it is. This is an impossible task, but we can do really good jobs of being really good at thick description. That's already kind of a theoretical exercise. Process models is more challenging in a practice theory perspective, because a traditional process model is still quite functional, a functional structuralist perspective, which all practice theories are post-structural. So what do I mean by that is a functional structuralist perspective would identify mechanisms, concepts, categories, and then try to connect them to other concepts, categories, mechanisms, and then have like a line underneath saying time that way, right? What they're trying to say is that the mechanisms are connected in time, but practice theorists would say underlying these mechanisms, the performance of these mechanisms is practices, and we're rather focusing on the practices themselves rather than the mechanisms. So there is a lot of room to be creative, and there's probably a way that you could work in a process model in a practice-based study. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's maybe less of the orientation when you try to represent practices. I had one point to make about the previous question too, is defining a practice is, what is a practice? Ontology is already a theoretical exercise, right? And it depends on which practice theory you also adopt, because Schatzky has a very clear way of talking about what is a practice, and Thomas has really nicely illustrated how you could use that to help you understand if you've identified a practice that you can research. But ethnomethodologists have a different way of thinking about practical activity. That's the more microscopic view of practices. It's very handy to see the taken for granted in the unconscious aspect. So if you're interested in that, that's a really handy framework for it. But there's also other practice theories that do different things. So activity theory, for example, is a practice theory that allows you to foreground conflict and interests and politics in practices. And if it's something you're interested in understanding, then that might be a better framework to use. And how you can conceptualize practice then also changes a bit. So this isn't there is no one answer, I don't think you can start off with. And then the last thing I want to say is this ontological exercise is for you helpful as a researcher to get a good grasp on what the phenomenon is you're trying to study, but it's just a heuristic in a way you need to do much more than this. You need to answer a research question that has relevance to a literature, something that's going on. You need to maybe even use the practices to explain something else. Yes, you can focus on elements of practices like the material dimensions, but you don't have to. You can just include that in your analysis of how a practice is being conducted, maybe the variations of the practice, how it's being conducted, and maybe its consequences. You don't need to use a theoretical framework in a very formalistic way. You can use it more of as a sensitizing device. Say, I'm just going to focus on practices, and then move into your methodology from that point. You don't need to use them as a theory per se.
Yeah, and I guess that's a nice point as well. It's about being in sympathy with the approach as much as anything. So as reviewing work, a lot of papers can have practice in the title. And as a result, I don't know about everybody else on the panel, but as a result, I get a lot of papers directed to me because there's practice in the title. So it's nice that people are aware of it. However, if you read the entire paper and the study hasn't been conducted in a way sympathetic or in line or in keeping with the practice approach, then it's practice. It's a very superficial. It's not really a practice study. So there can be different depths of engagement with it. And to echo what Neil was saying in terms of the paradigms or the theories that you're using, but at least that it's the study as an overall practice feel to it, where these are the phenomena that you're interested in, and you're exploring how they relate to each other and that relational perspective, I think is the overarching importance of a practice study.
Yeah, I'm the same, Orla. I get a lot of requests for reviews because EAP is growing in interest, but it's still being used quite superficially by a lot of people. They just enter the word practice, but the unit of analysis, if you just go right to the methodology, they're not studying practices. Yeah. And then it's not an EAP paper.
Yeah.
They're using it more as a framing, but it's not really being carried through to the study. So we don't really learn anything about practices themselves. And that's a shame because we don't really know anything about practices. We hardly ever study them. So it's always an aspect of trying to study practices.
I'm going to move on to a theoretical question, which is, what are the differences or relations between entrepreneurship as practice and entrepreneuring? And I love this question because we've had a lot of talk about entrepreneuring recently, and we had Daniel speak at, we had Chris Stayert speak at EAP 4 or 5, and then we had Daniel speaking, and then there's been a special issue on entrepreneuring at work studies as well, and we have some papers in that, which is great. So yeah, it's great to see that the attendees are curious about this overlap as well between entrepreneurship as practice and entrepreneuring. So would anyone like to chat about that? Neil or Sarah, considering we've recent papers, or maybe Neil, Sarah, you look a little bit startled. Neil, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
I'm sorry, I was also typing in the chat. So.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. I think with entrepreneuring, we're looking at the process of entrepreneuring more broadly. And again, if anyone is interested in the entrepreneuring work, as I mentioned, Chris Stayert obviously has written about this, and the recent special issue in Org Studies has focused on entrepreneuring as well, and looking at practice research as part of a wider, or as incorporated into the domain of entrepreneuring. So I think when we're looking at entrepreneuring, it's really how do people do entrepreneurship, and practices are a way of exploring how entrepreneurship actually unfolds. So I would see one embedded within the other. I'd see them very connected as opposed to disparate views, but perhaps the practice approach is taking a slice of at a moment in time almost, or a micro period in time of a wider entrepreneuring journey, and focusing in on that. And like Thomas explained, if you're exploring those the what, why, who, where of a particular phenomenon within this broader journey of entrepreneurship, in that more focused lens, I suppose.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. There's a great article that actually was really foundational when we were first starting to talk about EAP. I remember we had a conversation, Orla, even when we had the first EAP workshop about Chris Stayard's paper called Entrepreneurship as Conceptual Attractor. I'll put it in the. Okay, so what Chris Stayard does here is, so it's entrepreneuring, I'm sorry. So what Chris is doing here is showing that, okay, entrepreneuring is suggesting that entrepreneurship is a process, right? It's adopting a style of thinking as a researcher, of approaching entrepreneurial phenomenon as a process. So that's all entrepreneuring is saying. There's many different theoretical frameworks that are processual, like on the far end, on one side is like evolutionary theory, is a process theory. On the other far end is like post-structuralist theory like Deleuze and those kinds of things, assemblage. Those are quite radically different theoretical frameworks. Practice theory is on that list. It is one of the processual ways of understanding entrepreneurship. But it's not, of course, the only theoretical framework that exists. At the time of writing, I think it was in 2007 when Chris wrote that, there wasn't anybody really writing about practice theories in entrepreneurship. So it was kind of stimulating to develop this area.
At the same time, I think this is an area where it's quite interesting to look at what has happened in the SAP group, so the strategy as practice group. Strategy as practice actually started out with a professor emeritus at my university, Leif Melin, who was involved in that process. And funnily enough, the word strategizing and strategy as practice were used in parallel the first times. And it was not only until I think some co-authored book, a co-edited book by Paula Jabkowski and Richard Whittington, that they put their foot down and said, we are going to call this strategy as practice. So actually there was a couple of people who were trying to call this entire movement strategizing, also to better understand the processual flows of strategy. So I do think that we have a similar problem at the moment where we might use these two terms interchangeably. I don't think it's a problem. I can see very much how, if you call yourself, your study something related to entrepreneuring, you make a contribution to entrepreneurship as practice. I think that's pretty valuable as well. And I think if we look at other things, for instance, I'm toying around with the idea of looking at entrepreneuring as emancipation. That was a paper in AMR from 2009. And I think even there, even though it didn't say practice, it was sort of laying a foundation for looking at emancipation and entrepreneurship from a practice theoretical perspective. And it brings us down to the questions that were in the chat as well. I mean, what do you study? That's the point. I think that Neil made a very important point there. It's neither individual behavior, nor is it firm level. It's social practices that you're studying. If you see that you're studying practices, then you're on a good track to do something concerning entrepreneuring or entrepreneurship as practice or whatever you might call it at the end of the day.
And I think part of this as well relates back to what Bill was talking about at the start in terms of community of scholars. So the people who are interested in entrepreneuring and using the terminology entrepreneuring are equally interested in anything practice related and vice versa. So it's the same people, maybe using slightly different terminology, placing slightly different emphasis on different things, but they're not in conflict. They're very much in harmony together. And the scholars and the appetite for research in either camp definitely overlaps. And I'm trying to remember what the special issue title in Org Studies was, but I think at times if you read the call for papers, they definitely used entrepreneuring and practices interchangeably and nearly overlapping in a way that indicated they weren't competing terms or people weren't precious about the use of those terms, meaning very distinct different things. It was more that these concepts overlap and relate well to each other. So if you were thinking, gosh, I don't know if I'm doing entrepreneuring or if I'm doing practice research and this is just a minefield, then maybe don't get too bogged down in that, and just like what Thomas was saying, like just kind of look at the phenomena that you're studying and choose one of the terms and go with that then. But I guess our focus in the community has been on entrepreneurship as practice, and it's a wide umbrella, and entrepreneuring within that is completely open and acceptable as well. So yeah, we're certainly interested in both, I would say. Sorry, that's the title of the org study special issue. Thanks, Sarah. Organizational and institutional entrepreneuring, processes and practices of creating in an organized world. I mean, what does that not cover, really? You know, it's a broad church there. So that's by Trish and Chris Hertz. So you know, there's any of those papers in that special issue will address those concepts interchangeably almost. The next question that we had was, what are the remaining gaps in entrepreneurship as practice, and what types of questions would you advise a student to work on? I think this is a fabulous question, because as Bill was saying, and as we were saying as part of the earlier discussion in terms of outlining the history of entrepreneurship as practice, the community as well, is that it's such an early stage. The field is just beginning, really. We only start, this is the 7th conference, which is great in terms of having a history in this space, but we've a long way to go as well. So it's such an exciting time to be involved in this research. And definitely for me, this was one of the reasons I got involved in the entrepreneurship as practice community, because I felt this is an area I can make a stamp on, I can have an impact on, and I can learn, and I can also contribute and feel like my contribution is going to have an impact on my own knowledge and learning, but also on a community as well. So I think that this is a super time to be joining the community, because there's a little bit of a foundation there, but the field can go in any direction as well. So it's really exciting. And I hope we do get a sense of what everybody's research is in a sense, because that would just show us. I love if we could do a mind map almost of all of our research topics, and we could see what everybody is doing, because I'm sure there's plenty of areas that there's space for, that there is overlap and space for collaboration, but I am sure that map would extend to all 4 corners of the page as well. And there's certainly space for them all in terms of reviewing. There's need for work, I would say, on theorizing side, on the conceptual side, but also definitely in the empirical side. So any papers that I get in terms of practice, I'm always very open to trying to publish the work or support the work in terms of positive comments and reviews, so long as they're sympathetic to practice research as a whole. And I would say that would be the main thing. And if you're part of this conference, you already have a good foundation and an insight and interest in the theoretical side of things as well. So I'd say the gaps are endless. Does anybody else want to contribute to this one? Let me see if I can post the question again in case in the chat, maybe it's easier for people.
I agree with you, Orla. I think that there's we can get a little bit too caught up in the practice theories themselves. But I say, follow Wittgenstein, who says, don't think, look, just, we need more observation, empirical work on practices. And just what are the practices, what's going on, how can we explain them, how do they explain other things? That's the kind of work we need. And that doesn't need to contribute to the theoretical framework of practice theories per se. I think there's a lot of opportunities to contribute to, you know, research on pitching, or research on resourcing, or, you know, a myriad of any other topic entrepreneurship scholars are interested in. Practice theory allows you to make contributions to those literature. And what we should not get too caught up in is how does my empirical work fit in with existing practice theory? I kind of feel like there's so many more interesting questions than that. So there's so many more things we don't understand about practices, like we don't really study them. So, you know, there's so many things out there that we could study. And practice theory is like a style or a sensitizing way of thinking about the world, but it's just the first step. It doesn't necessarily mean we need to get out of a positivist mindset that we're testing practice theory in reality or something like that. That's not the case. That's not how we're using these theories.
I think that's very important. And I mean, to me, this question is also funny, because every time a student asks, what are the remaining gaps in X, Y, Z? I think these people are almost adopting a discovery view of entrepreneurship as well. It sort of seems like there are gaps out there and you only need to discover and fill them with your research. But think about the other scenario. I mean, and I think that's actually a better way to conceptualize academic work. The gaps aren't out there, but you sort of have to create the gap in a sense of bringing to the table what is new. So that's what Bill was talking about, right? I mean, what is new isn't out there, because if it was, it wouldn't be new, right? So it's this paradox that we have. So you have to create and bring it to the table. At the same time, I think you can take inspiration from other similar developments, and strategy as practice is one of them. So if you look at the work of pioneers in strategy as practice, we have Richard Whittington. And what has he done? He has spent most of his career trying to understand where the practices that are commonly practiced in strategic top management teams, where do they come from? And he has found out, look, there is like a couple of decades in strategy, which can even be linked to individuals, in particular, like strategic consultancy groups such as BCG or whatever, which then have transpired into all the top management boards. And I think this is a great opportunity for a PhD student to take out, where does this pitching standard that we take for granted in so many places of the world, where does it even come from? How did it happen that it ended up being so dominant all over the world? I think that's a very interesting question to ask. And I think also what Neil said, comparing between different contexts and trying to see what do we learn about all types related to entrepreneurship, resourcing, networking, talking, whatever.
Great. I'm just going to move on to another question that we have, and I'll pop it into, oh, sorry, Heiko, you have a great point that it's not like entrepreneurship is by definition static as well. So therefore, yeah, we are it is changing and it's evolving all the time as well, which leaves plenty of scope for exploration. This is another question. This is we're moving from the conceptual side and theoretical side down into the empirics and methods, and you had some fantastic questions in this. So to take one, for example, it's if practitioners rely on practical knowledge and cannot fully verbalize it, what is the task of the researcher? Is it to provide their own explanations of the practices practitioners engage in? I think this is a super question because it's actually very complex. There's different layers and levels to it. Neil and I have been working on a paper with Demo for a while now, where we're almost having this conversation, like, who is our research for? Is our research for ourselves as an academic community, or as even more narrow than that, as a community of practitioners who are interested in practice-based research, if we want to get very niche? Or is our research about being relevant and important to the wider practitioner community as well? And it's difficult because we're all using the word practice as a core to think of practices, practice research, and practitioners, and who are the practitioners in all of it. So I think this is a question that's actually quite difficult to answer as well. And then with practice research, who is it for, and what would actual entrepreneurs want from our research? And I guess we have to do this soul searching on a daily basis with our research, regardless of what tools or mechanisms or even conceptual models that we're working in, or philosophies that we're involved in, and trying to think of that, what we're doing as being transferable to the audience that we're actually working with is, it's quite sobering, and it makes you justify and think about, well, why are we doing this research, and how is it being funded, and how is that contributing back? So there's a couple of things that I feel about it. And first of all is that nobody likes to feel they're doing research just for research sake, okay? But by the same token, we are academics and operating in an academic community. And our community, as Bill was outlining at the start as well, is our peers and our colleagues and everybody, for example, here in this room. So I kind of do feel that actually a lot of our research is for our colleagues and for our environment as well, and those in our immediate environment. But back to that point of just doing research for research sake, for practitioners themselves, I think it can be helpful for them to have a greater understanding of why and how they are doing. And yeah, perhaps some of it is holding up that mirror to them and explaining in greater detail how what they're doing is unique or how it is different, or even by making explicit the implicit can be enough of a contribution to review why and how practitioners are doing what they're doing. So I think it can overlap and have benefit for the wider field too. But when we're publishing, I guess the priority tends to be back towards your implications for the community of scholars more so than the community of practitioners. But speaking to practitioners, sometimes it's difficult to justify why you're doing the study that you're doing and what they're going to get out of it as well. Does anybody else come into identity crisis when we start to talk about these issues and really wonder your place in the world? Thomas, what are your thoughts?
I mostly agree with what you said. I think that it's very difficult to figure out what it is. I think another audience we sometimes forget are potential students. I mean, the classroom students. I also like to think a lot that I conduct research so that I learn something that I can bring in the classroom and that hasn't been in the classroom before. So I think that's another motivation that we might add to the table.
Can I ask, is there anyone in the room who has questions, or if there's anyone if the person who posed the question is in the room, and if you have any thoughts, or in particular, I see people here with their cameras on, like Heiko and Ozioma and Catherine or Mary Sheka, like, do you have thoughts? Heiko, what are you thinking?
So that was my question. And it comes from an interaction I had with an ethnomethodologist, because I had this idea, and this comes a little bit from Giddens and discursive consciousness versus practical consciousness. So, okay, there's things that that practitioners engaged in practices cannot fully verbalize. So as a researcher, this is like where you can make a contribution, you can point something out. And I had a discussion with someone from ethnomethodology who said, they are constituting their reality in the moment, and they understand what they're doing, and they know what they're doing. Why? What is the need for a researcher to add on some artificial layer of understanding that is not present, like in the moment and the reality? And the person was saying, I see no value in that. That was an interesting comment, because as you said, there's other ways of thinking about it, like holding up a mirror, providing another explanation and see what sparks, like what happens. But I found it interesting. I found that position, like, what is the value of a researcher observing, not maybe engaged, but mostly observing, to add on another layer of explanation that does not seem to be needed or used in the reality of people engaging in the practice.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting as well. And so back to the birds in the nest study that Neil was talking about before, how much feedback do those researchers have to give the birds, for example? But I think in any study that you're doing, in any empirical study, you can always give a fairly quick and dirty report back from the field to the people that you've been involved with. And that can be observations from a researcher's perspective. And anyone I've ever spoken to has always been just really interested in having a researcher present to just have a different set of eyes. So I've done that previously, and it's not academic, it's not theoretical, it's just my perspective and observations in what was happening in terms of the processes and activities taking place. And sometimes that's the main benefit to them. So if you can kind of explain your research in that regard, that this is what your take home will be. And then if you're interested in it, there will be a theoretical and analytical side of it as well that's going to be more relevant perhaps to an academic audience. If you'd like access to that, of course, that will be circulated with you also. But the first thing would be that you get that industry report or summary. Catherine, do you mind me asking you, because you seem to have, you were saying before that you have quite a lot of data. So do you have experience of this as well, or how have you managed this dual role almost?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfectly. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm currently writing up my findings and working through my findings for my PhD, but I did a master's research project with the same organization. And what I did with them there is we developed a set of blogs and podcasts as a result of the research. So I would feed them just some snippets of, oh, these are some of my early findings. What are you interested in? And then the organization would basically come back and say, okay, well, this presents a few questions or challenges for us. And we'd start that dialogue. Then I'd write some blogs or record some podcasts where I'd basically address their main perceived challenges or questions arising from the indicative findings. I was hoping to do the same with a PhD, but I'm kind of swamped with the data, which is my comment earlier about I don't want to rush through this kind of processing, and it is so rich, there's so much in there. I don't want to kind of rush that too quickly. So yeah, I'm just kind of going through the findings at the moment, but that will be the plan again. And I think coming to your question about the audience, so I guess I'm a pragmatic researcher. I'm always interested in the so what, and what relevance does this have in the real world, if I can use that term, as well as the academic world. So I guess I am writing to that as well in the back of my mind. It's thinking, okay, well, how is this going to be useful for these people who've given me access, given me time, allowed me to observe them in all these different scenarios. They've been very generous in their time. What impact will this have for them as well? How can this be helpful? So I guess I've got that in the back of my mind as I'm writing too. There's obviously contributions to knowledge very broadly. I think that's my interest, is just contributing to knowledge of organizations and organizing, entrepreneuring. But I guess I'm thinking about the so what. How is this actually going to be helpful for entrepreneurs, nascent startups? Yeah.
I think that the idea of the blogs and the podcasts, I mean, that it's a lot of work, but it's a really nice back as well then. That's a nice impact study also on the kind of wider impact.
Sure, and I'm sure it helped my access this time for the PhD, and having conducted the research partly remotely and partly face-to-face, that was easier having already had those relationships. And that was our conversation at the beginning about this being this community. And I think as well, when we're writing and when we're doing the research, it is about developing those relationships as well and giving something back to the participants as well.
Great. And sorry, I've got a plumber. My plumber is fixing my heating system at the moment, which is, we've been without heat for 2 weeks. It's very critical here, actually, I can tell you that much. I'm just going to pass you over to Thomas for a second while I pop in. Everything is okay.
No worries, Orla. You see, that's the beauties and benefits of having virtual conferences as well, that we can still attend our plumbers.
Can I address the question?
Sure. Get in.
Yeah, because I have an opinion as well that maybe hasn't been stated yet, that the Heiko's question about the practical knowledge or the tacitness from the ethnomethodologist is correct from my perspective, that yes, indeed, the people can perform their work without the researcher there very much. That's very much true. And they rely on socially learned, unconscious to do so, which is, I think, totally true. But the fact is that the reality is unfolding, and it's possible to change the flow of things. And practices matter for people. It's not that we're constructing conceptual models that are helpful for us, but the practitioners can't relate to per se. Pitching matters for entrepreneurs because they're trying to do something by pitching, which is maybe getting resources, for example. Understanding for them and for us on how this is happening only can inform how that can happen in the future. And that has real consequences. And we're talking about things as innocuous as entrepreneurship practices, but there's a lot of things in the world that are produced with ill effects, and we can make impacts here by realizing why there's a reproduction of things with negative consequences, and what could we understand about the unconscious that could change the flow of this reproduction of these negative consequences. And I think that's where our research can have an impact for education, for students, for example, but also for practitioners that are doing these things, as well as us as researchers. We learn more about why these practices matter. So I guess my simple answer is that practices matter for practitioners. So that's why studying them also matters.
I think that, I don't know if Sarah, do you have anything to add? What's your point of view?
Yeah, so first of all, sorry, I got kicked out of the meeting earlier because my computer is forcing me to reboot because, you know, it's the middle of the night here. So that's when things reboot here and I couldn't circumvent it. Anyway, I just wanted to add, so to the point of, you know, things that, you know, practitioners cannot fully verbalize, there are still ways, and maybe that's why we immerse ourselves so much in the field to study practices, right? Because sometimes you know, if it's, let's say, a craftsperson or an artisan, when I did research with the artisans, they would actually try to verbalize something. They're like, oh, I can't put it into words, but here, feel this. And I would feel the wood while the artisan was, you know, building a guitar. And I couldn't put it into words either, but I got it, right? Because I could feel, so it's very sensory, very aesthetic, right? And so that's where, you know, participant observation and active research or, you know, autoethnography come in really handy, especially for studying practices that, again, are not easy to verbalize or you can't really observe because sometimes you can't observe them. Or sometimes it's things that you can observe. So for example, gestures, right? They're very quick, but you can micro-analyze them as well. And there are ways of representing them as well. So Corneliusen, I'll put it on the chat. Corneliusen, Clark and Chinky from 2012, they have photographs of, you know, how do people give meaning, right? And then they have actually arrows showing the motion of the gesture. So sometimes we have to be creative about how we also represent those things that are not verbal, they are nonverbal, but there's a lot that can be represented. And I think the researcher there comes in with a big role, right? Because they're also making sense with theory. So going back to knowing the audience and where you want to write your work and publish, if it's academic, let's say organization studies, you have to have a theoretical contribution. So we're kind of navigating between what's the extant literature, what is this practice, and how can I make a contribution? What doesn't exist yet? How, you know, what am I seeing here that people haven't depicted yet? But there's also practitioner-based journals where we can talk about these, maybe it's an N of one practice, right? And it's maybe they're doing something unique and that could help other practitioners too. Like, how do you create value, whatever it is, right? So knowing those audiences, I think, are very, very helpful. Yeah, I hope that helps.
I want to just pick up on what Frank has written in the chat. The used language, vocabulary is important. The language is extremely important, I think. And how it goes to representation. And what Sarah is saying is that sometimes it's hard to represent practices in text. We have to translate everything into a text as researchers, or this is what we do typically, because we need to write it. And this is just how we think about things, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's sometimes it's easier to represent the non-conscious aspect of practices not through text. We don't really have the infrastructure right now for publishing those types of studies. That's not true in other fields, like cultural anthropology accepts full-length video documentaries as articles to publish. So you can experience something as the viewer. This is way too radical for our field right now, but I think that this is something we could do. You know, this isn't something we could bring into for a reason, of course, but there's all kinds of opportunities to do things differently, how we do things also as scholars when we try to represent practices that we could explore.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting, actually, Neil. And if there are journals that come to mind for you, could you pop them into chat maybe, Neil, for us, or where you have seen really exploratory work? Because sometimes what I find is it's very difficult to, I'm so siloed. I'm so used to just kind of operating in my little bubble that when I go outside that bubble, I just get completely overwhelmed nearly. And even trying to find other fields or other fields to connect to or other journals and publications, I'm like, where do I even find them? So I'd say to anybody on the call, if there are, outside of the traditional kind of management journals that we're familiar with, if there are other other places where work's published in this area that's really interesting and innovative, please pop it into chat, because it'd be great to even get a notion of how they do it in other fields. Can I just skip maybe the last question that was up there was last question we kind of highlighted in terms of discussing was about publishing questions, and where is the bar for sufficient contribution in an entrepreneurship as practice paper, and can you give both positive and negative examples? And I just might just say briefly, this was kind of along the lines of what I asked Bill as well, and he made the excellent point that there have been special issues in entrepreneurship as practice in EORD. We have our handbook, of course, in entrepreneurship as practice. Bill and Bruce also published a book on behavior, practice and process, I think, a few years ago, maybe last year or so. And then there's a special issue in org studies. So there's lots of special issues coming out as well. So what I might do is just skip back to a previous question on the whole area of methods is we've about 5 minutes left in this discussion, but is it desirable or necessary to connect practice-based accounts of entrepreneurship to extant research and theory? And if so, how does one go about it, especially balancing critique versus recognition of insights in the extant literature, as well as connection to extant vocabulary and theory versus being true to a practice theoretical perspective? Any practical tips? That's a really great question. And is the author of the question there? If the author who submitted the question is online, be sure to, hey, go.
And by the way, I think we have until 1, right? Or until.
Oh, sorry.
So we still have like another half an hour, 25.
Oh, sorry, excuse me, I missed the. Yeah. No rush.
Just not to rush, right, Orla? We have time. We have time.
We'll go through all.
I was getting panicked, you know.
Thanks for that, Thomas. Well done. Okay, Heiko, tell us a bit more about this, or do you want to explain where you're coming from?
I think, yeah, the main where I'm coming from is IB, international business. If there's a field that is probably as far away from practice that you can get, I guess that might be IB. So I look at international entrepreneurship, and the first time I mentioned something, and it was at a doctoral consortium, I mentioned, I'm trying to apply a practice perspective. And people were, oh yeah, I talked to lots of CEOs too. So whoop, and there was no, like, literally the theory, the word had no meaning. So I've been struggling ever since to look at what's going on in international entrepreneurship and to connect what I'm doing and seeing to what's actually going on there, because there's an international aspect to what my entrepreneurs are doing, which is relevant, important, interesting, right? But the how do you call it, spagat, or I don't know what the word is in English. Basically, the spread is far. And that means I usually get criticism from both sides, right? From the one side, this is not sufficiently processual, or this is again entitative thinking, etc. And then from the other side, what does this even mean? Where's this theoretical contribution? Like what do you have? So that's basically where I'm coming from. This bridging exercise has been troubling me since the beginning. And to foreshadow it, I see, or I feel there's a certain necessity and value to it, but I don't know how to do it really. So there's that's where the question is coming from.
Well, thanks for explaining, and thanks for submitting the questions, of course, as well. I think that work is the most interesting, where you're connecting the two. I find that really super, because I think you're bringing new insights into an established area, and you can, for me, it really brings practice research to life as well. So I think the part of the challenge might be in identifying the outlet that's going to be most sympathetic to it. So if you're speaking to your IB audience that is very purist and driven in, you know, in their thinking, and aren't particularly open to considering this other element of the IB work, then maybe the publication outlet might be towards something else, or maybe your research has multiple findings, and some findings could be written up as a pure IB type of paper that's going to make a significant impact in that discipline, but then other work just submitted to journals that are more open to practice-based research, which is an expanding base, and we can speak about it in plenty of time in a moment, because we're not rushing to finish by past. So looking at those publication outlets that are sympathetic to the practice research, you're going to be making an interesting contribution to practice work, but with the IB slant. So I think I'm not sure where you've been, if you've tried to submit work already and received that response, or if it's attending IB conferences with your practice research, but maybe they're just not ready for it yet.
I mean, I have similar thoughts here, and I think you also have to take a decision at some point. So if you find that there is no ongoing practice stream, or say like international businesses practice, then you will have probably trouble publishing a paper that from the front end, from the intro, from the theoretical framework, shouts practice theories at the readers. They will probably then, because then you will get into a situation where on the one hand side, you will get 1 or 2 reviewers who are into the theory, the more structuralist point of view of IB, and a reviewer who is a practiced or process ontologist, and then you're caught in between the two chairs. So you have to be sort of strategic in publishing there. And it means that if you want to publish in the IB journals, perhaps it's a better way to tune down your practice approach, use it as your methodological lens, as your unit of analysis, but don't really mention it until perhaps only in the method section, right? That your unit of analysis, you looked at practices of how people unfolded and what you did and so forth. And then you make sense of it in the end of the paper, but trying to tune that down. And I think it has helped a lot in our field as well. That was this 1 or 2 studies where I see, well, actually they've studied practices, but they never said it's practices. I think it has helped a couple of people to publish in very established and very highly ranked sort of general management journals in our field as well. So it's a pretty blunt strategy that you have to take. And then if you want to have the IB as practice discussion, I think as a PhD student, the best thing to do is to find other or more senior scholars who are willing to take this step. And I think Neil and Orla can tell you much about how EAP was founded or grounded, right? It wasn't by a PhD student who published a piece on entrepreneuring in a major EAP journal. It was in connection to more senior people who brought in a new idea, right?
Yeah, and they might actually be talking about it in different ways. So I'm just thinking back to the question on entrepreneuring. Do you know, is there somebody in IB who's doing IBing or something? Do you know that there could be established scholars doing something related, not necessarily labeling it as practice, and maybe that's your community there, that's your tribe there.
Yeah, there are a couple of people.
Yeah,
Catherine Welch. Yeah, so it's there.
It's often also in the critical studies, right? So
yes.
I think that, you know, if you look at critical studies of X, then you often find that people who are perhaps closer to our understanding in this virtual, semi-virtual hybrid room.
Yeah, and then it's just figuring out the journals, right, that will accept that type of work. But I also think you need to think about the future, where you want to go, what type of school, and geographical location actually sometimes matters a little bit too. Because, you know, when you get on a research stream and you have your pipeline, you have a certain type of research identity, if you will, right? And then you have those papers, it's going to take a few years to get published. So I think thinking about, so for example, I've decided when I was a PhD student, I had an advisor that supported me on that. was to do what I was passionate about, because academia is already so hard, right? If you're not doing what you're passionate about, it becomes even harder, right? So I wanted to do more critical studies, not do mainstream entrepreneurship. So I knew that, I was going to have to find a school that was supportive of that, right? Because there's no point in me trying to fight, because the standards, right? I mean, publications are our currency, right? And that's how you get evaluated and so forth. So then I think finding what type of school, even though you don't know what school you might end up in, and things are different in Europe, I know. So like in North America, so I got my PhD at the University of Missouri. If you got the PhD there, you can't get a job there. So you have to go somewhere else, right? So that's the approach here. So if you know that you're going to have to go somewhere else, or if you know that you can stay where you are, figuring out whether the audience, your colleagues are going to support, even if they're not doing the same type of work, right? If there is openness to that type of work as well, right? Because ultimately they're going to make tenure decisions as well. So I think keeping that in mind and figuring out what you're passionate about, and just enjoying the work that you're doing, right? Because I think it's awesome being critical and doing non-mainstream work and finding your community, right? This is how EAP is so important to me, at least, right? I really found really support. Sometimes it's just knowing that there's someone out there that also sees the world as you do, right? And you're not just, the extreme outlier. That was my nickname at University of Missouri. It was the extreme outlier, which I embraced. I really liked it. But anyway.
And we'll also be touching on some of this, I think, in our career discussion later as well. So I think this conversation now is a really nice way of framing the conversation. Will be continuing and looking at the challenges that we've all faced and maybe that you're going to be facing as well in terms of trying to manage these different streams of our research, and how do we pull it all together on the outside, at least, to create to make it look like it's very smooth decision making or happening in the background. So then we can go back to the question. Sorry, I plowed ahead with it because I thought you were pushed for time. I hadn't read my document in enough detail, but this was the question that I was referring to. Where's the bar for competition? Sorry, my audio might be with entrepreneurship is practice. Perhaps this is something that we can all document or in the chat. So if there's any articles, my audio really bad.
I think we're getting feedback from Frank.
Yeah.
Frank, do you mind muting yourself?
Sorry, we can't really hear you, Frank. It's too soft.
I think we need to mute Frank.
Yeah, I think we're getting feedback from his audio.
I muted him.
Right.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
That was interesting. That doesn't happen in an in-person conference.
No, and I was kind of like, does anybody else hear that? Is that just me hearing that?
I was only you.
It's only me, yeah, exactly. It's like I really need an upgrade here. But so if anyone has any examples of practice papers that you've read, either in entrepreneurship, in general management, in org studies, in any kind of journal, why don't we pop them into chat now, and we can have a repository, almost a template of good papers as well.
Well, I put one that I found really important, me personally. It's an article by Davide Niccolini and Maya Korika, I think. I don't know how to say her name, but it was in organization science. It's really new. It's excellent. And I think the excellent is that how they framed the paper and how they were able to communicate the current limitations with the literature, and how a practice-based study can, make an impact into that literature. And to me, it's super helpful as a guideline, because what they do is basically problematize from a practitioner perspective the different demands that people have on their attention, especially CEOs, and then reviews the literature on what we know about CEO attention and points out all of these aspects that aren't researched, because people tend not to actually look at CEO attentional practices. So by unpacking those, they make a huge contribution. And I think it's a really great article that's useful guidelines for everybody that wants to do a practice-based study. I think I can imagine that kind of framework being used in all different sorts of literature and entrepreneurship studies, like networking or pitching or something like that. Its basic setup is quite similar. So I am super enthusiastic about that paper, and it was motivational for Orla and I's recent org studies paper as well on how to set up the framing of the article.
Yeah. And then, as I had touched on earlier as well, we have the special issue in ERD, special issue in algebra, and 2 handbooks also looking at practice research and publishing practice research. And Neil, you have an upcoming special issue. Would you like to say anything about it?
Sure. Here, I might as well just share my screen because I think I have a slide prepared about it. I was going to do it later, but I might as well.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. I'll just do it now. Yeah, I've never known how to move it though.
I think you can drag it.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, this one. Can you see it, Orla?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a special issue in human relations. It's kind of along the same lines as the practice process special issue that was mentioned already. But it's a new special issue, and what we're going to do is really foreground practice theories as well as process. So people that also take more of a post-structuralist process perspective. I'm thinking like radical processes like Deleuze and things like that. We also are very interested in, but very much practices and entrepreneurship. And this special issue is specifically trying to look at the intersection between entrepreneurship, work, and organization, and how these 3 different concepts are interrelating when people do entrepreneuring at work. And that's purposely broad because we want to bring in a lot of different types of studies. And I think the key point that I want to mention here is that we are specifically looking for really creative and different type of research articles. So like people that are really willing to experiment with the form and the style and go for non-representational theories and do that kind of stuff. I think novelty is something that we're really looking for, even more so than a normal article, I would say. So we're not thinking of novelty as contribution to an existing theory. We're kind of not in the positivist way, but more in the pragmatist, practice theorist, and processual kind of thinking about contribution. So I know that that's a bit vague, but it's also trying to, the special issue, the point there is to push people to do new stuff and try to think about even their own research in new ways. So if you want to know more about that, of course, you can always chat with me, but we're going to have a workshop in December this year where we'll give feedback on draft versions of papers and help coach what we're looking for. And then the actual articles will be due in April. So about a
Really exciting. It's great call. So hopefully that'll be an outlet then for other great work in this area.
Yeah.
Mariska, can I ask you your hand up? It's great. You want to join in?
I had a question in it. It looked like all the questions were addressed on the list that you had.
No, that's fine. No.
Okay. So so that's done, and I can jump in. So I'm wondering how process theory can work with process tracing can work with practice theory, and I ask because I don't see very much of that being published. I'm looking at social entrepreneurs and bringing in ethics of care and wanting to study their practices. And process tracing is interesting to me as a very guided way of understanding practices and there's great training out there. And as a second year PhD, the training aspect is very, very appealing, and it's very, very clear. I think that it will add some credibility or an anchor to using ethics of care. And process tracing, just for those who might be unfamiliar with it, and I'm only learning about it, but has its roots in psychology. What is in a person's head? What are they thinking? And then has really taken home with political scientists as a method of what is the black box of practices with the epistemic community? How do they access and influence decision makers? And so essentially it's what we're doing. You know, maybe they grab a glass of water for the person, and they put their foot in the door, you know, in different tacit ways and behind closed doors practices to access decision makers. And so process tracing has a very clear methodology of looking at those practices. And it seems like it makes sense to me, but I'm also wondering, being novice and unfamiliar, that there might be that paper or that aha that unravels it all and says, no, they're not compliments. So that's why I asked this panel. Oh, and also I want to say thank you, Heiko, for the great questions, and also the reading group. So this conference and Heiko's reading group have been excellent. Thank you.
Great, and great question. The process tracing, that's really interesting. So I'm the main thing I would say that comes to mind for me, and it obviously is open to everybody and the panel to contribute to, but if we, with practice research, we're moving out of the heads of the entrepreneurs, I guess, out of the heads of the practitioners, and more about the relational aspects of what it is that they're doing. So I wonder with the process tracing, if the focus is predominantly on the cognitive processing of the individuals. No, okay.
Yeah, the putting your foot in the door, or, you know, holding a hand a little extra long, or, you know, these some that's just embodied, and some that are cultural, but effective.
Yeah. So it sounds like there could be great overlap.
Sounds like a good paper to write.
Yeah.
At the same time, I mean, I just, you know, I'm one of these guys who always in the background runs their Google. And so I just Google it up. And the first thing that comes up is that process tracing is a research method used to develop and test theories. And it uses experimental settings. So I don't know if that is true for the version of process tracing that you have in mind. Perhaps there's multiple ones. But this particular thing of what I just popped up quite intuitively, I think would sort of contradict the post-structuralist approach of practice theories. So I'm not sure whether process tracing in its technical form, if you want to test a theory, is a very useful methodology to understand practices.
It has 3 different camps.
Right.
And
Okay.
In the surface. So please, if I sound like I know a lot about it, I don't actually. But it has theory testing, theory building, and an interpretive camp.
Yeah. I think that, I think great if you can bring it onto the table. That's important. At the same time, I would be questioning, or I would ask, if I get this as a reviewer, I potentially would ask, like, well, why didn't you use any of the existing frameworks? What was missing from them that you added by using process tracing? So in a sense, I think it's still what Bill said, you know, every time you want to engage with a community, you need to read up for many years on what has been published, and you need to understand what are the understandings. So you won't get around this, at least. I think it's like Neil has also put this in, but you can see it? No, wait, I'll unblur my background. But this book here, I think that's the quickest way to read around what is practice and what isn't. And it also offers you like different versions of practice theories, and they are all equally valid and equally practice theories. So in a sense, you could, for instance, look at what has Nicolini said, these are the major practice approaches, and how does process tracing add, or does it change anything? Then I think it's a good way to to contribute something.
Thank you.
So Heiko, I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Heiko, is it?
Heiko, yeah.
Heiko. He's wondering, Mariska, what it is about the process tracing that you're finding helpful. Might be worthwhile. It'd be great if you could just share your experiences. Is it the gathering data, the coding?
And I'm only just beginning to learn, but that it's a pretty well articulated methodology for collecting, analyzing, maybe akin to a historical approach, but more through a political science lens, but how historians might use archival data to put together practices in a process, how they might trace that through. But it's a pretty well articulated method, and then has its own exclusion criteria for mapping out the quality of the evidence. So it uses very much an evidence type of language. And since the theories that I'm interested in are more philosophical, I thought, oh, I wonder if this might add a little weight. lock this down. But then there's you know, a 2-week workshop coming up, a full-time 2-week workshop, and I feel, well, that's a nice opportunity to feel like I know one method well.
Great. It sounds like it's definitely a useful tool for you and in your research. Very interesting to hear about the approach as well. And
I think it's kind of interesting to even add, so make your own and call it practice tracing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, if this is a good match, then why don't I see it in the literature? You know, so that made me a little cautious. Thank you.
Read around, because there's a lot about methodologies for practice-based studies. There's a lot that's been written, and practice tracing is kind of nice in a way of if you could, you know, get the idea of as a methodology of tracing practices. And again, we're not really we're in the interpretivist camp. So you said there was an interpretivist camp. We're very much an interpretivist camp as practice theory researchers. So there's not going to be a once and for all way to best represent practices definitively. Punt, you know, this is still a perspectival type of research. So there's going to be many tools we can draw on to come to conclusions, and practice tracing, process tracing could be one, could be nice, but you have to, I don't personally know what it is. So I'm just trying to be encouraging, being kind of interesting to find out.
Thank you.
I really like that idea, Neil. And I also don't know what process tracing is. So I quickly Googled it because, you know, it's 10-second research. And one thing that I see is that it's based on causal or unveiling causal mechanisms. So I would be a little concerned there, but Neil's idea is really great, because maybe that's one thing you can problematize, right? Maybe there is too much of a causal underlying assumption to this type of methodology, but you can review. So if you write a methods paper, you would just review the literature on that method, right? And then carve out the space to create the whatever methodology you're proposing, which is practice tracing. I really like it. It's really great. And then from there, you develop your own methods. And then a lot of times people do this, right? They will write the method first, publish that, and then use it for their dissertation, because there's legitimacy for it now because it's been published, right? So you could do that for sure. I really like that idea. And there's lots of journals that publish methods pieces nowadays. So like the top one would be Organizational Research Methods. Org Studies is also starting to publish methodology pieces, management learning, there's qualitative research, qualitative inquiry, there's lots of places to work on methods pieces. And sometimes people don't even think about writing methods pieces. And there's just so much that can be done on the doing of qualitative research, right? So yeah, I encourage you to do it too.
It's a great idea. Yeah. There's been there were loads of questions that unfortunately we haven't had time to get around to today. But if there's anyone online who has a question that we haven't addressed, please pop up your hand, pop it into chat, and we've got a few minutes where we can discuss it. So if we didn't read out your question, apologies, but you can raise it now or at any stage during the day, and we'll try to get to it again. And just see, there's none that
I do have a question.
Yeah, please, Ozio.
So I guess as I delve deeper and deeper into this area of inquiry, it seems like there's a lot of intense approaches to the actual research itself. And so I just keep thinking to myself, like, from an empirical standpoint, like, what are the ways of actually getting access to be able to, I saw 72 hours of footage, you know, like a big ethnography. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, what is the scale and even the relationship with case studies as a methodology versus just like semi-structured, you know, structured interviews? Like, what are the methodologies that can support this kind of like, you know, discourse-oriented relational approach to practice? So that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think it's a great question as well. And I guess that can be one of the daunting things about the practice research for someone entering the field, but it can also be one of the parts that's most exciting as well, because it allows you kind of get deep and dirty into the data and into an empirical setting that you might not if you were looking at other research questions or using other research approaches. So you mentioned semi-structured interviews there, and I guess the limitation, and this again as a reviewer, this is something that I see someone doing practice research, they conduct semi-structured or even worse, structured interviews, and then they've made some kind of insights into practice, and it's like, well, we can't really say we know much about the practices by interviewing someone about them. Now, it's interesting because we actually have a book chapter on interviewing for practice research, and that's going to be discussed either Tuesday or Wednesday. I can't remember which day. Wednesday, yeah. So that'll be an interesting conversation we can have with that author about their views on interviews for practice. So they're creating an argument that supports interviewing for practice research. But yeah, so a lot of the work will have either video methods or that they'll be involved in the field through some kind of observation study or some kind of ethnography type basis to it.
And what of the ones where I was reading a lot about, like, the actual researcher immersing themselves and participating and being an entrepreneur and all of that? Like, the reason why I'm asking is because I could see that being relevant in certain areas, but for my PhD research, I think my supervisors are like, what? You're now going to become an entrepreneur, which I am on my other side of business. But it's kind of like, I've been trying to separate my entrepreneurial life and my research life. And this is asking to merge it. And I'm just kind of trying to understand, like, how does that really happen? And what are the rules and regulations? And is that actually even a more appropriate for PhD research, or is it appropriate down the line, you know?
And I get Bengt Johannessen's work on inactive entrepreneurship is very much in this space where he's pushing people, like, you know, really encouraging them to start enterprises, to get involved in entrepreneurial ventures in whatever realm they can, to get those firsthand experiences. But I guess it's all on a spectrum, isn't it? You know, and it depends on the research questions, as Sarah was saying before. It depends on you have to get your PhD, you know, so there's a certain amount of playing the game as well, and knowing the rules of the game within your own institution too. Sarah, do you want to come in there, because it sounds like you've had experience in this space?
Yeah. So I when I was doing my PhD, I was a practicing arts entrepreneur. So I had my own family business promoting the arts in Portugal. And so one thing that I did, because I mean, being an entrepreneur actually gives you an opportunity and access to study things that you might not be able to study otherwise, right? So I wouldn't completely reject the idea of doing that. But what I did was, and first of all, you need support from your committee. Your committee needs to be okay with you doing work as an entrepreneur, right? So I had buy-in from my committee. My committee was okay with it. But then the deal was, I can't just do that study. I also have to do another study. I ended up it was an ethnography, and I ended up being very embedded in the field as well. I think it's just how my brain works. But it was ethnographic, not autoethnographic. And even the one that I did with my family business, it was not autoethnographic, it was inactive research. And I gotta tell you, it was harder to get published than the other one. So the other one was submitted to Org Studies, got published, no problem. The one on my family business, reviewers had questions about like how, you can't just be studying your own family, right? So then you have to figure out that you have to have a team to help you become reflexive, right? Because you could be too immersed. And this is what I was telling earlier, that sometimes adding co-authors to the theme actually helps you see things that you might not be seeing. And so I had meetings with my co-authors every week, and they would ask me questions and challenge, but tell me, what does this mean? And why are you seeing this? And so forth. So we've had those conversations, and the reviewers appreciated that, because that's important for reflexivity. And it keeps me grounded too on, the stuff that I was seeing or not seeing in the field. So I'm a big fan of, using your own entrepreneurial experience, especially, to study practices. I think it's amazing, but it's really important to have committee support, and maybe balance that out with a non, your own business study, just because in my experience it is a little bit harder to publish.
And adding to that, I think you've mentioned Bengt Johannesson's work on inactive research.
Yep.
So Bengt Johannesson has a very clear statement that he doesn't consider it to be inactive research if you're simply doing the job already. For him, the project has to be started purposefully with the intention to do research on it. And he also states that there should be a clear endpoint to it. Now, this can be debated, I think. Right, so I personally think that some of these assumptions that he's proposing for inactive research might be debated. At the same time, I think there is value to think of it in that way. If you are an entrepreneur already, and if you've been an entrepreneur and then started your PhD, is your reason for studying your own being entrepreneurial, is it in order to sort of, the data is there and I have access to it? Or what's the purpose of it? Why is your case a good case to understand entrepreneurship? I think that's something that you have to ask before you start thinking about it. So what's the point? I mean, I personally have made the experience that just collecting data without preparing and without really knowing what you're going to look at and why you're doing it, might create a lot of work later on if you try to untangle everything and find what's interesting, right? So that's just a note of caution there as well.
Okay, so I think, Thomas, are we good for time? Is this an appropriate time?
I think so, yeah.
Good. Great stuff. So thank you very much for everybody for your contribution and your engagement so far. Hopefully you're enjoying the conference as much as we are. It's really good, and it's lovely to see that we're all experiencing similar problems and challenges with all of this stuff as well. So we come back after break, and we were looking at the idea of career progression and practice research as part of that story as well. So very much building and picking up on these the questions that we've had over the last couple of questions that we've had from the group. So Neil, do you want to say anything about logistics, or are we?
No, just 1 hour. We'll be back. I'll leave the Zoom open, but we'll be back in an hour.
Okay.
Bye.
So over the break we were chatting, and it came up that it would be nice to save the chat. So I will, before we close the meeting, make sure I download the chat. This is, of course, being recorded too, so I'll also post the recording elsewhere. If people are jumping in and out, they may want to go back and watch things. And I just posted this from Lancaster University, which is kind of a hub for practice theorists. There's a really good webpage there. I went to the consortium and I've done different things there, and it's great because it's practice theorists from all these different social science fields. So you see all the different kinds of people using practice theories in all these different ways and different social science research. And it's really inspiring for how you can also do something for that with like in our entrepreneurship niche area. So yeah, I just wanted to share that before we started. Okay. Who's chairing the session? Do you know off the top of your head, Thomas?
I think I might
I
be.
don't. Who?
Back to me.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to find my notes. Apologies. Here. Trying to remember which email I had them in. So just could I have 1 sec to just get this?
Yeah, take your time, no problem.
For those of you who are interested, the good news is my heating is fixed. It's a celebration here. We're all delighted to note.
Is it cold though?
Yeah, well, it has been freezing here.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it was a bit annoying, but we're okay now. So let me see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So sorry, just building on, we were chatting at the first session or before Bill came on, just about how Sarah, Thomas, and Neil and I had gotten involved in practice research in the first place. And then the way the discussion was going in the last session was about how to almost juggle these multiple identities that we have and combine our main research field or another research field with entrepreneurship as practice as well. And I was wondering, perhaps we could speak about how we do that on an individual basis, and then also how practice has fed into our careers as we've kind of progressed as well. So is Sarah or Thomas or Neil, would any of you like to start us off?
You choose.
Okay, what about you, Sarah? Do you mind? Because you mentioned this a little bit earlier as well.
You're still awake.
So,
you're still awake. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still awake, so that's good. So how practice theories have influenced our career, I guess?
Yeah, and the two things. So you mentioned that you had another stream of research, I think, possibly as well. So how you combine it with the practice research, and how then the practice research has fed into your career. So I suppose it's the two related sides.
Yeah, so I mean, early on when I was doing my PhD, again at the University of Missouri, it was always very process oriented. So I noticed from the very beginnings, probably because my advisor was also very much process oriented, and he did more stuff in complexity theory and Austrian economics. So I dabbled a little bit in that. And then I started figuring out also my way in what I was passionate about. And that took me into aesthetics. And then from there, so always remaining processual, but in a post-structural way, I guess. And so one thing that I did on this new OS that just came out, which is part of my dissertation, took all of these years to get published. So we developed a process model, and it's very much post-structural, I guess. And even the approach to the qualitative research is also post-qualitative. And I think that feeds in pretty well with practice theory. So we were studying imaginative practices, but it was quite informed by radical process philosophy. And from there we used like the metaphor of a rhizome, building from Deleuze and Guattari, and all of that, just really informed the research. So I think I don't see them as different, practice or radical process philosophy. Sometimes one is more prominent than the other, perhaps, but I think they inform one another. And I found, like I said earlier, I found practice theories just by meeting Neil and reading Bill's work, and just meeting everybody at the academy, and then continually making sure that I was attending all of those sessions. As a PhD student, I wasn't able to get funding to go to Europe to the EAP conference, unfortunately. Now, luckily, we have this hybrid model, which makes it a lot more inclusive too, right? So But I had to wait until I was an assistant professor here at the University of Victoria to actually then start going to the conference. So yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. What about yourself, Thomas? Has your research always been in practice, or you have another stream of research as well?
Yes and no and yes, and I mean it's you know, if you look at what I've published, it's not a lot, right? So I think that when when I did my PhD here in Sweden or in my institution, we have a couple of sort of guidelines, or actually norms, how a dissertation has to look like. And among these is that if you write a compilation thesis, i.e. a thesis that consists of multiple papers, as I think is mostly the norm nowadays, it has to include 4 papers, and 2 of these have to be single authored. So that's sort of an institutional norm that I had to oblige by. And I took the decision that, well, I want to use practice theories, and I'm going to write the entrepreneurship papers myself. And I think that is why I also struggled to get it published at the end of the day. Because I was alone on that project, as I said, this big data collection, trying to make sense of it. And I got advice from many different people, and everything was great advice, but it was pulling me in different directions. Right? And at some point I thought, like, maybe I should use practice theory only as a lens, as a methodology, sort of as an understanding, and connect it to different theories. And that's what enabled me to get this paper at the end of the day in a review process in a fairly good journal. Even though it was rejected now after 2 rounds. That's unfortunate, but it happens, right? But it was an option out of there. So I think in a sense, yes, practice theory always sort of influences my understanding of things, even though I might not necessarily include it up front in the papers that I'm writing or that I'm planning to write. And then again, there are some ideas that I have now and that we have also shared at EGOS, and I think that I've talked to you guys about as well. Of course, these are more core to the discussions that we have concerning entrepreneurship as practice. And yeah, so in a sense, practice theory was in my dissertation at the end of the day. It was my philosophy chapter, right? What is my ontological understanding? And it draws through all of the papers in some way or another. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, Ola.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting seeing how it kind of has materialized and crept in different ways. What about yourself, Neil? Were you hired and then started getting into practice research? Because it wasn't part of your original PhD, was it?
No, it wasn't. I started using institutional theory during my PhD, but I was still an entrepreneurship researcher, and I was trying to look at entrepreneurship and institutional theory. What was really interesting there is institutional theory is quite structural. It, puts the structure up above and how that influences agents down below. And I was trying to understand the interrelationships between these kind of bigger social structures, institutional logics, let's call them, and the entrepreneurs, the agents. And somebody just mentioned to me off cuff, like on I think it was my second year of my PhD, saying, oh, if you're interested in the relationships, you should read some structuration theory. And I was like, oh, what is that? So I read, and I took a deep dive. I read like 3 of Anthony Giddens' books, and it was all about overcoming this duality of structure and agency. And I was just like, whoa, this is exactly what I was interested in. And I had no idea people had tackled this so thoroughly. But it was also kind of recent, like in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. I was like, well, this, like compared to other philosophies you can read, this is pretty new stuff. So I was like, well, this is pretty cool. So I got really interested in that. I didn't know that there was such a thing as practice theories. I only at that time knew about Giddens structuration theory. I hadn't connected any dots. I was really doing this on my own. My supervisors had no idea about any of this. They were pretty hardcore economists. So not very helpful in that kind of reading. So I was just kind of doing my own thing. And I did my PhD. And shortly after that, I got hired at the VU. I got hired here because I think as assistant professor, because of the work with institutional theory that I was doing, I was starting to move into more like institutional work and how entrepreneurs manipulate institutions, which is kind of dealing with the structure and agency issue. And I had the back of my mind, I wanted to do something with structuration or how I could build that in. And I met Karen here, and we just had lunch one day and we talked about this, and she was super enthusiastic and knew a lot more than I did about the topic. So she gave me a lot of things to read. And then I found David Niccolini's book, and that just opened my eyes to all this whole new world of practice theories and entrepreneurship. So I decided there that I really wanted to do projects on this. And then at the same time, Bill and Karen were talking about a totally different project. But I started talking with Bill about practice theories, and he was like, he didn't know so much about it at the time, but he was really enthusiastic. So we decided to invite him over for a talk to kind of do like an exploratory meeting. And that's when we had the first EAP, and Orla was there, and a lot of other people came. And Davide Niccolini was our keynote speaker. And I learned a lot from him. And so from then on, I was like, all right, this is practice theories and entrepreneurship. This is going to be a really cool thing. Nobody's doing it. It's got a lot of potential. So Bill, as you heard in the morning, he's been saying that same thing to me for the whole time. You got to build a community. You got to get a lot of people on board. You're going to need reviewers. You're going to need co-authors. So that's the way that has developed for me. I think my tenure decision was based purely on my research. My institution didn't care at all what you publish on. They have no criteria for content. It's all points. So in that sense, it's kind of liberating. As long as you can get the points, you can do any journal. Our system doesn't have a journal list. It's just all journals have points. And so you can just shop around to find the kind of points that you need. So it's quite freeing in a way, because I can publish in all different types of journals. So my tenure decision was just really rational, bureaucratic, rational decision making. So it wasn't very political or anything like that. But I was, very lucky that that's how my institution works, I guess. I mean, there's some drawbacks of the objective criteria, because it's not really objective in the end of the day. We make all kinds of weird decisions on how much points are allocated to certain things, but at least you know in advance what it is. So that's how it worked for me. So I went just straight from PhD to assistant professor, and then 5-year tenure track, and was tenured 2 years ago.
I think as well, one thing that's come up for me since, and it kind of goes back to the point that Heiko was mentioning as well about this IB literature, and then, the practice literature. And it seems like we all have background of that, where we're doing non-practice research and then practice research. And the biggest challenge I've had with it has been in terms of creating a coherent academic narrative. And it's like, so why am I interested in such very different fields? And for promotion in our institution, and just for general coherence, I guess, that's one of the things that I've struggled with, is trying to patch together the research interests. And I like that idea of being multi-passionate as well, because I think that speaks to a lot of us here. And we're nearly sometimes a bit like magpies, going after shiny, interesting things that appeal to us. So I've kind of restricted on my researches in business failure, and looking at very much the individual, and a euphemism for being unfocused, probably, yeah. But yeah, so I look at emotions, coping, learning, sense making mostly, those kind of constructs in relation to people after and around the context of business failure, and then this practice research as well. So when it comes to creating that coherent academic narrative, it's not always apparent how they overlap, because in practical reasons, they are very separate parts of my research. I don't look at the practices of business failure, for example. Like, the fields just don't merge at the moment because of the different data that I have in projects and teams that I'm involved in. But I think that probably is the challenge for all of us. And the only in terms of doing practice research plus something else is how you then sell it to other people, and other people being your tenure committee or a promotional committee or something like that as well. And then in terms of publication, somebody else had mentioned, are there publication outlets that are supportive of practice research? And yeah, certainly some of them are. So you probably will have different reading for different parts of your brain for the different studies that you're doing. And I think it's interesting following your interests, but then it's probably not the most savvy in terms of your time. So the reading is so different. I'm just wondering if anybody else is in the same boat then, that sometimes there's there's this opportunity cost of, if you're working on one project, you're kind of losing momentum on your reading for another. So definitely, I think if you could have your research kind of fit more closely together, it's probably a more efficient way of going about your research. Because if what Bill was talking about, getting up to speed in the literature takes that length of time, and you're working in two different fields, then yeah, that would be the challenge that I have faced, I would say, in kind of combining practice research with other research as well. So I'm not sure, yeah, if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask us. It might even be worthwhile if we heard what stage of your PhD everybody is at. We have a list of questions here that might be of relevance, but it'd be great if we heard what stage you were at, and then we got a sense at what might be the concerns if you're in first year of your PhD, or if you're kind of coming towards the, sorry, somebody has already asked this. Have they? About what stages of your PhD? No? Okay, maybe if you want to pop it into chat at kind of second year, okay. So you're probably in the field, Mariska. You were saying earlier you're kind of thinking about getting out into the field and trying to understand this process. So third year, second year, third year. So for the third year, are you about to start writing up? Is it 3 of 4 years or 3 of 3 years? Fourth year writing up, working as professor. Okay, so you're combining it with your work as well, and just in the field. Okay. For people who is there anybody who's kind of looking towards the jobs market and trying to get ready at that stage? Final year analysis here as a career consideration. Okay. And Catherine, do you have any idea of what direction you'd like to go, or like, you want to stay in academia? I
came into it for academia, so I was teaching within the university for 6 years prior to the PhD, but without the PhD. So as a university teacher as opposed to lectureship. But I guess it's opened my eyes to other opportunities. So looking at research projects and research consultancy as well. Yeah, just trying to juggle all those things at the same time at the moment.
Yeah, it's challenging with your time, isn't it? And then there's a lot of uncertainty as well. Kind of, you're in a little cocoon when you're doing your PhD almost, because your next 3 to 4 years are guaranteed, you know what you're doing. And then afterwards, you're coming towards the end of that, it's like, well, what is next? Is anyone considering entering industry? So Catherine, that example of getting into consultancy, perhaps, is anybody else considering that route, or does everybody want to stay in academia?
I kind of now in between, and I'm also wondering if someone has experience in that. I really like teaching, and now again I also realize that I also like conducting research, but sometimes I miss the polarization a little bit. So the building the bridge with practice, and I've heard some people say that in the Netherlands there's a bit more connection between theory and practice in hogescholen. Is that graduate schools?
No, applied science university.
Applied science universities. Is there anybody who knows someone who's working there, and how does it work?
So that would be a little bit of both, is it? It's more applied research. Is that what that is?
I'm employed at a University of Applied Science, and they in our institution they build research centers. So you're kind of like a school teacher. You have 1,600 hours, and then you can apply for 400 hours of research or 600 hours, or you can go fund yourself, and then you're more free. But the main currency in that kind of institution is teaching.
Yeah. Okay.
I see Shari has here about remaining to keep an open eye on industry, but keeping keen eye on academia. So my question would be, what are some examples of practice theorists in industry? I mean, that's a really good question, and I don't have the answer, but I remember I was recently at a PhD supervision training thing, and the whole discussion and statistics were showing how many people doing PhDs actually remain in academia and how many go into industry. So overwhelmingly, the number of academics over the last 30 to 40 years have remained consistent going into academia, but the number of people taking PhDs has grown hugely. So then they were saying that traditionally academics looked at this as being, you know, such a waste or a loss, but now the trend is coming more around that, how good that is for society, for industry as a whole, to have more people with PhDs entering industry. But and in some disciplines, they're almost growing PhDs, not for academic reasons, but for industry reasons as well, for the knowledge spillover and the connections back to uni and research and all that side of it. So there seems to be this growing demand for the skills base externally in industry as well. So it's kind of, it's not always, industry hasn't always been covered as a topic for discussion in PhD consortia. Certainly any consortium I was ever part of, it never even was mentioned. So it's good to see that it is part of the conversation, because that mirrors reality, I think, as well. So back to your question then, Shari, about what are some examples of practice theorists in industry? I don't know, does anybody have any examples of practice theorists specifically in industry?
Well, I just shared a site called EPIC, and it's the Association for Applied Anthropology in Industry. And while anthropologists aren't necessarily practice theorists, many of them are practice theorists, because their focus is usually on practices and the relationship with communities. So I think it's quite similar. They do have an entrepreneurship actual section as well, because industry is mostly, they hire, Google hires ethnographers and things like that to do industry projects for them. There's all kinds of really interesting connections with ethnography and industry. This EPIC is a main resource for that. And then they also, have some entrepreneurship things that come through this EPIC conference. I've not joined any of the entrepreneurship stuff, but it's super interesting. There was somebody, Laura, who joined the EAP, I think it was online last year, who is the leader of this EPIC entrepreneurship section. So if anybody is interested in connecting with her, I can put you in contact, actually, so that can go a little bit more than just what you can read on their website. But it's super cool. You use a lot of the skills about ethnography of what you learn in doing your, this type of research. But the audience it's applied. So the audience are industry executives, design teams, creative teams. They want to know how this works. There is a real resonance for this kind of stuff. So there's some nice bridges to be built there. I see one of their events is called Reimagining Business Models, for example.
Very good. I think that as well would be a lovely link back in. We mentioned impact earlier, and more our universities are looking for impact implications from our research. And that would be a really awesome way to show that what you're doing is actually very grounded in industry needs, and that you're using it to inform your study, but then also to disseminate your findings. So sounds brilliant, actually. Must check that out as well. Cool reference. So how many people online already have positions? So Heiko has, you've got a professorship, you've got a position. Is there anybody else? Recently, congratulations. Is there anybody else in that boat? No. So Heiko, where did you hear about your job? Is it in the university that you did your PhD in, or?
It's internal. So I think I have to mention that I'm based in Colombia. So the requirements and, for example, everything like tenure works a little bit differently. And I think that as soon as I published my first paper and had my PhD candidature behind me, the university was yeah, I applied to the first position in my department and was taken. So it's internal, and I think that was the plan all along. The university usually educates their own professors. That's kind of the idea there in the PhD program.
Yeah,
it's actually I am obliged by my how do you call it? Not a stipend. The financing of my PhD is conditioned to me accepting a job at the university. 50% of my PhD is conditioned to me accepting a job, or was. So yeah.
And that's a different model that. Sorry, Neil.
Said that's kind of nice, a built-in job.
Yeah, only that it's a credit. Basically, you finance 4 years of pay and PhD on credit and on a basically a mortgage on your house. And then if you take the job, they say, okay, you don't owe us anything. But yeah,
otherwise
still it's nice.
Yeah, well, it's a bit of security there. I think for most of us, the policy of where we did our PhDs was as soon as you're done, you're out. So I can understand that actually came as quite a shock to me, I have to say. And I only discovered it as I was going through the PhD. But whatever stage you're at, it might be worthwhile having a conversation with other people and PhDs more advanced or people in your department to just try to understand what is the culture. Because if you are around there and you're thinking, oh, maybe I can be kept on as a postdoc, or there'd be those kind of postdoc opportunities. But if that's very contradictory to the kind of culture, it mightn't even be a policy, it might be just a culture or a tradition. It's worthwhile finding that out sooner, and then that can also influence kind of how proactive you are in networking at events and going to conferences and all that kind of thing, that you have it on your radar that you're going to have to be looking for things externally as well. Shari, I'm not sure. In fact, I'm probably pretty certain I'm mispronouncing your name. Would you like to turn on your mic, Shari, and tell us more about? Yeah, please raise the question. Yeah.
Sure. My name is Karis. So
Karis.
yeah, and I guess the question is about the geographical embeddedness, because I see a lot of practice theorists and people using practice are in Europe. And I'm not sure if this is, accurate enough, but I've seen a map, and a lot of it was just like a lot of pins were in Europe and only a few in North America. I'm in New York, Syracuse University, and so I'm wondering whether this matters for careers. I guess building connections is one thing, but making a career out of this perspective and using that to study entrepreneurship, does that mean that I should expect, for example, to be in Europe someday, living there, or does it matter? It does not matter as much. That's something I'm thinking about, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, super observation, and even by looking at the attendees and the conference and the time zone, I guess we are very Eurocentric, aren't we? Sarah, you've had experience in the US. Do you want to share what your thoughts are?
Yeah. So I think you're right that there's less of us in North America, and maybe it's more Europe centric. I don't see it as a bad thing though, because to me, if I had to rationalize it, it actually helps me to bridge or build bridges with Europe, which is important to me because I am European. I'm originally from Portugal, and so I like having that connection. In my case, so where I was before at the University of Missouri, there was no one doing practice research at the time. Here, where I am at the University of Victoria in Canada now, I think there's maybe a couple people doing practice research, but there's definitely an openness for it. So I think the most important thing to do when you're looking for a job or thinking, is this going to be a good fit or not, is, are your colleagues going to be supportive or open to that type of research? And does that matter to you, right? Because maybe that actually doesn't matter. But, if you're thinking about getting tenure, tenure also works different in different schools. Some schools, everybody has to vote on someone getting tenured. In my case here, they form a committee. It's usually 4 people, and then they make a recommendation to the dean, and then the dean makes a recommendation to the provost, and that's how the decision is made. So So I guess I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. I think as long as it makes sense for you to be doing practice research, and of course, if you want to move to Europe, I think that might actually be helpful, right? But if you want to stay in the US, I don't know that there's a drawback necessarily. And maybe Neil, since you're American, you probably have some opinion about this too.
Yeah, I think very cynically, well, one cynical way of putting it is that nobody cares nobody cares what you're doing as long as you're publishing well. So in that way, you can kind of leverage that, because I have people in our university, in our field here, that don't really understand what practice theory is, or will say things like, to me, I find it very semantic what you're doing, so I don't really understand. And it's like, okay. But they don't really have to get it, because not everybody I write to is going to have to read my articles and agree with me or something like that. So that's fine. But there has to be some people,